They say an alpha without a pack is just a beast waiting to remember it's mortal. King Vaelor Draven built an empire on blood and conquest, crushed rebellions before they could breathe, made kingdoms kneel without firing a single arrow. 12 years. 0 weaknesses. Until a servant girl with sharp eyes and sharper words walked into his throne room and reminded him that monsters don't rule forever. They just die alone. This is the story of how the most feared king in the Dominion learned that survival without purpose is just a slow death with a crown on. Stay with me until the end, and if this hits different, smash that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know my tribe is listening. Let's go. The storm hit Stormfire Palace 3 hours before dawn, and Vaelor Draven stood at the eastern tower watching it tear across the obsidian cliffs like the world itself wanted to remind him that even gods bleed when the wind turns sharp enough. He didn't sleep anymore. Hadn't in years. Sleep was a luxury for men who believed tomorrow would arrive without betrayal attached to it, and Vaelor stopped believing in safe tomorrows around the same time his younger brother tried to poison him at a peace treaty dinner. That was 11 years ago. His brother's ashes were still scattered somewhere in the Blackwater wastes, though Vaelor couldn't remember exactly where anymore. After the 15th assassination attempt, bodies stopped mattering. Only patterns mattered. Only survival. The wind howled against the tower glass hard enough to crack it, but Vaelor didn't flinch. He stood there in the dark, wearing nothing but black trousers, and the jagged scar across his throat that ran from ear to collarbone like a permanent reminder that crowns were never inherited peacefully. His broad shoulders carried the weight of an empire built through conquest, and his amber eyes reflected the lightning outside without any warmth behind them. 12 years of rule. 12 years of watching men smile to his face while sharpening knives behind his back. 12 years of learning that loyalty was just fear wearing a prettier mask. Behind him, the door to the tower chamber opened without knocking, which meant it was either an assassin or General Cade Theron, and since Vaelor was still breathing, it had to be Cade. Good. I need someone to tell me I'm not losing my mind. Cade stepped into the tower room like a man walking into a funeral he was contractually obligated to attend. 6'4", built like a siege weapon, scarred knuckles, and a face that had seen every corner of violence the Dominion had to offer. He'd served Vaelor since the beginning, back when the throne was still slick with Vaelor's father's blood, and half the noble houses were betting on how long the new king would last. Cade stopped 5 feet from the window and crossed his arms. "Nobody lives this long by accident, Your Majesty." Vaelor didn't turn around. "You hear them?" "Hear who?" The whispers. "The entire palace sounds like a conspiracy wrapped in silk and political etiquette." Cade exhaled slowly. "They've been whispering for 12 years. Why does it bother you now?" "Because now they're right." The general frowned. "About what?" Vaelor finally turned from the window, and the firelight from the torches caught the exhaustion carved into his face like erosion on stone. He looked older than 36. Harder. Like something essential had been extracted from him one betrayal at a time until all that remained was function without feeling. "I have no heir, Cade. No Luna. No weakness they can exploit, which means no humanity they can trust. I've spent 12 years making them fear me because fear keeps them obedient. But you know what happens to kings who rule only through fear?" Cade said nothing. They die surrounded by people celebrating. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Cade shifted his weight and glanced toward the door as if checking whether anyone else was listening. Old habits. In the Dominion, walls had ears and ears had daggers attached. So what's the play? You finally ready to pick some duke's daughter and pretend you care about strategic alliances? Vaelor laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that had no joy attached to it, just bitterness wrapped in resignation. That's exactly what the council wants. Marry someone politically convenient. Produce an heir. Lock myself into another layer of obligation and pretend it's strength. It is strength, Cade said carefully. Alliances keep empires stable. No. Fear keeps empires stable. Alliances just give people more creative ways to betray you. Cade studied him for a long moment, and Vaelor could see the concern building behind his general's eyes. Concern was dangerous. Concern meant people started making decisions for you because they thought you couldn't make them yourself. "What are you planning?" Cade asked quietly. Vaelor walked past him toward the long table covered in maps of the Dominion, territories marked in red where rebellions had been crushed, trade routes highlighted in gold where prosperity flowed as long as nobody asked too many questions about how it got there. The rite of the crowned Luna happens in 2 weeks. I know. I'm bringing back the trial of Dominion. Cade went completely still. You can't be serious, dead serious. That trial hasn't been used in 4 generations. Do you know how many noble bloodlines failed it publicly? How much chaos it caused? Good, Vaelor said coldly. Let them fail. Let the entire empire see that titles don't mean strength. Bloodlines don't guarantee loyalty. I'm done pretending that political marriages create anything except more elaborate forms of betrayal. Cade shook his head slowly. This is going to start a war. We're already at war, Vaelor said, his voice dropping into something darker. We've been at war since the moment I took this throne. The only difference is whether I keep pretending diplomacy works, or whether I finally force everyone to show their hand. And what if none of them pass your trial? What if every noble daughter fails? Then I rule alone. Cade stared at him. You'll die alone. Vaelor met his eyes without hesitation. I was always going to die alone, Cade. At least this way, I'll die honest. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside, and somewhere deep in that silence, Vaelor realized he'd already crossed a line he couldn't walk back from. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't even politics. This was exhaustion dressed up as rebellion, and maybe that was exactly what the Empire needed. 2 weeks later, the Hall of Ascension inside Stormfire Palace looked like every nightmare about power and pageantry had been forced into one room and told to behave. Vaulted ceilings stretched 60 feet overhead, lined with black marble columns carved with wolf sigils that seemed to snarl down at anyone arrogant enough to walk beneath them. Silver banners hung from the rafters, snapping in the artificial wind created by the massive heating vents that kept the hall warm enough for political theater but cold enough to remind everyone that comfort was a privilege, not a right. Thousands had gathered. Every noble house across the Dominion sent representatives, dressed in their finest ceremonial armor and silk gowns that cost more than most frontier villages earned in a year. They sat in tiered rows that rose toward the walls like an amphitheater designed specifically for public judgment, and their faces carried that particular blend of ambition and entitlement that came from centuries of inherited power. At the far end of this hall, elevated on a platform of obsidian and iron, sat the Iron Throne. Vaelor hated that throne, hated the weight of it, hated the symbolism, hated the fact that sitting on it meant agreeing to a system built by men who believed domination was the only form of leadership worth respecting. But he sat on it anyway, because refusing to sit meant admitting weakness, and admitting weakness meant inviting the kind of chaos that ended with palaces burning and empires fracturing into warlord territories within a generation. So he sat, broad shoulders wrapped in ceremonial armor made from blackened steel and wolf fur, the crown of ash resting on his dark hair like a physical reminder that authority always came with a price. His amber eyes scanned the crowd with the kind of calculated emptiness that came from years of treating every gathering as a potential ambush. Somewhere in the third row, Lady Nicera Volcar watched him with the intensity of a predator who'd already decided which part of the kill she wanted. 26 years old, daughter of Lord Malrek Volcar, one of the most powerful warlords in the Dominion, beautiful in the way sharp objects were beautiful, dangerous if you got too close. She wore crimson silk that matched her house colors, and her dark eyes promised the kind of political alliance that came with chains disguised as wedding vows. Vaelor looked right through her. In the fifth row, Lady Elira Morath smiled like someone who'd practiced that exact smile in front of a mirror for 6 hours. Blonde hair pulled into an elaborate braid woven with gold thread, pale skin that had never seen labor, and the kind of delicate posture that screamed, "I am a prize to be won." Her father controlled the Western grain territories, which meant marrying her would secure food distribution and trade dominance across half the empire. Vaelor felt nothing. Row after row of them, daughters of dukes, heirs to fortunes, political solutions wrapped in expensive dresses, and every single one of them looked at the throne like it was the destination instead of the trap. General Cade stood to Vaelor's right, wearing full ceremonial armor and the expression of a man who'd bet against this plan working, but showed up anyway because loyalty meant standing beside your king even when he was making catastrophically bad decisions. The High Chancellor, an ancient bureaucrat named Oren Gravet, who'd served 3 kings and outlived all their optimism, stepped forward and raised his hands for silence. The hall obeyed immediately. "We gather today for the sacred rite of the crowned Luna," Orin announced, his voice echoing across the marble like a sermon built from obligation. "By ancient law and tradition, our king will choose the woman destined to stand beside him as Empress of the Dominion, Luna of the Wolf Throne, protector of the realm, and mother to the heirs who will carry our legacy forward." Vaelor almost laughed. Legacy. As if any of this mattered beyond the immediate survival of maintaining control. Orin continued, "Let the candidates present themselves before the throne, that the king may—" Vaelor stood abruptly, cutting him off mid-sentence. The entire hall went silent. Not the polite kind of silence that came from respect, the dangerous kind that came from confusion mixed with fear. Vaelor descended the steps from the throne slowly, deliberately, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of cold authority that made grown men reconsider whether survival was worth the risk of speaking out. "The throne does not need another ornament." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "A ruler who stands beside me must survive the storm, not merely admire the lightning from a safe distance." Orin's face went pale. "Your Majesty, the rite has specific traditions that I'm aware of the traditions, Chancellor. I helped bury the men who created them." Nervous laughter tried to break the tension and died immediately when Vaelor's amber eyes swept across the room like a blade. "Which is why I am invoking the trial of dominion." The hall exploded into chaos. Nobles shot to their feet, shouting over each other in outrage. "This is madness. The trial hasn't been used in generations. You'll humiliate every house here. You'll start a civil war." Vaelor let them rage. Let them scream. Let them show exactly how much they cared about tradition when tradition stopped serving their interests. Cade stepped forward, hand resting on the pommel of his sword, and the hall slowly quieted under the implied threat. Vaelor continued, his voice cutting through the residual noise like a knife through ceremony. 3 trials. 3 tests. Any woman here who believes she deserves to rule beside me will prove it. Not through bloodline or political connections, but through strength, strategy, and the ability to make choices that prioritize the empire over personal ambition. He paused. "Or you can leave now, and we'll all stop pretending this is about anything other than transaction." Nobody moved. Not because they agreed. Because leaving meant admitting they were exactly what Vaelor accused them of being, ornaments dressed as leaders. Lady Nicera stood slowly, her crimson dress catching the firelight like blood on silk. "And if we refuse your trial, Your Majesty, if we reject this insult to our houses, then you prove my point," Vaelor said coldly, "that you only want the crown when the cost is comfortable." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't sit. Good. At least someone here had a spine. The hall settled into a tense, humiliated silence, and Vaelor was about to dismiss them when a single voice cut through the quiet from the back of the room. "I accept your trial." Every head turned. Vaelor's eyes tracked the voice toward the rear of the hall, near the servant corridors where the lower staff usually stayed invisible during ceremonies. A young woman stepped forward into the torchlight. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, no ceremonial embellishments. Dark brown hair pulled back into a practical braid. 24, maybe 25 years old. Pale skin, sharp features, and eyes that looked like they'd spent too many years reading things other people wanted to stay hidden. Serena Vael. Vaelor recognized her immediately. Palace archivist. Low-born. No title. No political weight. And absolutely no reason to be standing in the middle of the most important political gathering in the Dominion acting like she belonged there. The hall erupted into laughter. Not polite laughter. Cruel laughter. The kind of laughter that came from people who needed someone beneath them to feel powerful. Lady Nicera turned towards Serena with the kind of smile predators used right before they went for the throat. "You? A servant? You think you can stand beside the Alpha King?" More laughter. Serena didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She walked forward through the rows of seated nobles like she'd been invited personally, and the confidence in her stride was so unexpected that the laughter started dying before she even reached the center of the hall. She stopped 10 feet from Vaelor and met his eyes without hesitation. No fear. No false humility. Just cold, calm assessment. I didn't say I could stand beside the king, Serena said quietly. I said I accept the trial. If I fail publicly. But at least I'll fail honestly instead of pretending bloodline makes me qualified for something I've never earned. The hall went dead silent. Vaelor stared at her. Actually stared. Not with amusement, not with dismissal. With something far more dangerous. Interest. Because for the first time in 12 years, someone had walked into his throne room and refused to play the game everyone else was playing. And somewhere deep beneath the armor around his soul, something shifted. Not desire. Not attraction. Something worse. Recognition. He saw himself in her, the isolation. The exhaustion of pretending strength meant never asking for help. The quiet rage that came from watching incompetent people inherit power while competent people died invisible. Cade leaned closer and whispered urgently, "Your Majesty, you can't seriously—" Vaelor raised a hand, cutting him off. "What's your name?" "Serena Vael. You understand that accepting this trial means facing public judgment, political sabotage, and quite possibly assassination attempts from every noble house that views your presence here as an insult?" "Yes." "And you still want to proceed?" Serena's eyes didn't leave his. "I didn't say I wanted to. I said I would." Vaelor felt something crack inside him, something he'd spent years building walls around. Hope, the most dangerous emotion a ruler could feel. He turned back toward the crowd, and his voice carried the kind of finality that ended arguments before they started. "The trial begins in 3 days. Any candidate who wishes to withdraw may do so now without consequence." Nobody moved. Not because they wanted to compete, because withdrawing meant looking weaker than a servant girl who had nothing to lose. Vaelor returned to the throne, sat down, and watched Serena walk back toward the servant corridors without looking back. The nobles whispered furiously among themselves. Cade stared at him like he'd just declared war on reality itself. And somewhere deep in the palace, plans were already being made to ensure Serena Vael never survived long enough to face the first trial. But Vaelor didn't care about their plans, because for the first time in years, he felt something other than exhaustion pretending to be strength. He felt curious, and curiosity was the first step toward giving a damn about something beyond survival, which meant he was already in trouble. 3 nights before the trial, Vaelor stood in the moon chamber overlooking the frozen sea and tried to remember the last time he'd made a decision that wasn't rooted in preventing disaster. He couldn't. Every choice for 12 years had been reactive: stop the rebellion, crush the conspiracy, secure the border, eliminate the threat. An entire empire built on preventing collapse instead of creating something worth protecting. The door opened behind him without knocking, and Vaelor reached for the dagger hidden in his belt before recognizing Cade's footsteps. Old habits. "You need to sleep," Cade said. "I need the noble houses to stop treating the throne like a prize they can win through manipulation and marriage alliances." Cade walked to the window and stood beside him, staring out at the dark water. They found the first body an hour ago. Vaelor's jaw tightened. "Who?" "One of Lady Nysera's handmaidens. Poisoned. They're saying it was meant for Lady Elira, but the girl drank the wine by mistake." "Of course they are. The trials haven't even started, and they're already killing each other." Vaelor said nothing. Cade continued carefully. "The servant girl. Serena. You realize she's going to be the primary target?" "I know. And you're fine with that?" Vaelor turned toward him, and his amber eyes carried the kind of cold calculation that made even loyal generals reconsider whether honesty was worth the risk. "I'm not fine with any of this, Cade. But if she survives what they throw at her, she'll prove she's stronger than every bloodline in that hall. And if she doesn't—" He stopped. "If she doesn't? Then I was wrong about her, and this empire deserves exactly what it's going to get when I'm gone." Cade shook his head slowly. "You're gambling the stability of the Dominion on a servant girl with sharp eyes and no political training." "No," Vaelor said quietly. "I'm gambling on the possibility that strength doesn't only come from people who inherited the right last name. What if you're wrong? Then I'll die alone on a throne surrounded by people who smile while sharpening knives. Same outcome, different timeline. The silence between them stretched long enough to feel permanent. Finally, Cade exhaled. "You're going to get her killed." "Probably." "And you're fine with that?" Vaelor looked back out at the frozen sea, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of exhaustion that came from years of carrying weight nobody else could see. "I'm not fine with anything anymore, Cade. I haven't been fine since the day I learned that ruling meant choosing between survival and sanity. But if Serena survives this, if she proves that competence matters more than bloodline, then maybe, just maybe, this empire becomes something other than a machine designed to crush anyone who doesn't fit the mold. And if she doesn't survive?" Vaelor didn't answer, because they both already knew. If Serena didn't survive, Vaelor would burn the entire noble system to ash and rule through fear alone until someone finally succeeded in killing him. Which meant, either way, the Dominion was about to change. The only question was whether it changed through evolution or collapse. The first trial took place in the Hall of Ancestors, a massive chamber carved directly into the mountain beneath Stormfire Palace, where the stone wolves watched from the walls like silent judges, weighing the worth of everyone who entered. 12 candidates remained. Lady Nicera Volcar stood near the front, crimson silk replaced with practical leather armor, her dark eyes scanning the competition like a tactician identifying weak points. Lady Elira Morith looked pale but determined, her delicate hands clasped together as if prayer might save her from whatever was coming. And Serena Vale stood at the back, wearing the same simple black dress, no armor, no weapons, and absolutely no indication that she understood how much danger she was in. Vaelor descended the stone steps into the hall, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step he took. No ceremony this time, no audience, just the candidates, the king, and the question that would separate leaders from pretenders. He stopped in the center of the hall and let the silence build until it became unbearable. Then he spoke. "Famine strikes the empire. Crops fail across the southern territories. There is only enough grain stored in the royal reserves to save either the capital or the frontier villages. Not both." He paused. "Which survives?" The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade waiting to drop. Lady Elira answered first, her voice shaking slightly. "The capital must survive, Your Majesty. Without the seat of power, the empire collapses into chaos." Vaelor's expression didn't change. Lady Nicera stepped forward. "Protect the capital. The military and noble houses are concentrated here. Losing them means losing the infrastructure that holds the Dominion together. The frontier can be rebuilt once stability returns." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the other candidates. Logical answers. Politically safe answers. Exactly the kind of answers Vaelor expected from people who believed power meant protecting their own interests first. He turned towards Serena. "And you?" Serena met his eyes without hesitation. "Save the frontier." The hall went completely silent. Lady Nicera laughed. "That's suicide. You'd condemn the capital to starvation for villages that contribute almost nothing to the empire's economy?" Serena didn't look at her. She kept her eyes on Vaelor. "You asked which survives." I answered. "Explain," Vaelor said quietly. "Because starving people near the throne suffer quietly," Serena replied calmly. "They complain in whispers. They wait for relief that might come. But starving people abandoned at the borders don't wait. They become desperate. Desperation becomes rebellion. Rebellion becomes civil war. An empire dies from the edges inward, not from the center outward." She paused. Real rulers understand that survival isn't about protecting power. It's about preventing the conditions that make people destroy power. The silence that followed was so complete that Vaelor could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears, because Serena had just spoken aloud the truth he'd buried for years. Fear kept people obedient, but fear without care eventually created enemies. And enemies didn't wait for convenient moments to strike. For the first time in 12 years, Vaelor smiled. Small, dangerous, real. He turned toward the other candidates. "You are dismissed." Lady Nicera's eyes widened. "What?" "The trial is over. You failed. But we gave the correct answer." "No," Vaelor said coldly. "You gave the safe answer. The politically convenient answer. The answer that protects the people you need to maintain your own power." He gestured toward Serena. She gave the honest answer. The one that prioritizes survival over comfort. That's the difference between a leader and someone who inherited a title. The hall erupted into outrage, but Vaelor was already walking toward the exit, and Cade's presence behind him made it clear that arguments would not be entertained. Only Serena remained standing in the center of the hall, surrounded by furious noble daughters who now had a very clear target for their rage. And as Vaelor climbed the stairs back toward the palace, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't testing her anymore. He was hoping she survived, which meant he'd already started caring, and caring was the one thing an Alpha King could never afford. That night, someone tried to kill Serena. She was walking back toward the archive chambers through one of the servant corridors when three figures emerged from the shadows wearing masks and carrying daggers that gleamed in the torchlight. No words, just intent. Serena ran, not out of fear, out of tactics. She couldn't fight three trained killers in an open corridor, but she knew every hidden passage in the palace because archives didn't just contain books. They contained building schematics, guard rotation schedules, and maintenance tunnels that nobody remembered existed. She ducked left into a storage alcove, shoved aside a rack of cleaning supplies, and disappeared through a panel in the wall that led into the ventilation system. The assassins followed. Mistake, because ventilation tunnels were narrow, low-ceilinged, and forced attackers into single file, which meant superior numbers stopped mattering and momentum became everything. Serena crawled fast, taking turns she'd memorized years ago, listening to the sounds of pursuit echoing behind her. She reached a vertical shaft, grabbed the maintenance ladder, and climbed until her arms screamed. The first assassin reached the ladder and started climbing. Serena kicked the rusted bolts holding the top section in place. The ladder collapsed. The assassin fell 20 feet onto stone and stopped moving. The other two hesitated. Serena kept climbing. She emerged into the eastern watchtower, lungs burning, hands bleeding from the rough metal, and found herself face to face with General Cade, who was standing there with his sword drawn like he'd been waiting for her. "You're faster than I expected," he said. Serena leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. "You knew they'd come for me. Everyone knew they'd come for you." "And you didn't stop them?" Cade sheathed his sword. "The king wanted to see if you'd survive." Rage flashed across Serena's face, hot and immediate. "He used me as bait? He used you as a test. There's a difference." "Not from where I'm standing." Cade stepped closer, and his voice dropped into something colder. "You walked into the most dangerous political gathering in the Empire wearing a servant's dress and challenged every noble house by accepting a trial you had no business surviving. What did you think would happen? They'd welcome you with open arms?" Serena straightened despite the pain. "I thought the king valued honesty." "He does. That's why you're still alive. But honesty without strategy just gets you killed in interesting ways." He turned toward the door. "Follow me. The king wants to see you." "Why?" "Because you survived, and surviving means you're worth the risk." Vaelor stood in the moon chamber staring out at the frozen sea when Serena entered, escorted by Cade. He didn't turn around. "3 assassins," he said quietly. "1 dead. 2 fled. Not bad for an archivist." Serena's voice was cold. "You knew they'd come." "Of course. And you let them." Vaelor finally turned and his amber eyes caught the firelight in a way that made them look almost inhuman. "Would you have preferred I station guards outside your door, announce to the entire palace that you needed protection? Make you look weak before the second trial even begins?" He stepped closer. "You wanted honesty, Serena. Here it is. The moment I protect you, you become a pawn. The moment you survive on your own, you become a threat. Which one do you want to be?" Serena held his gaze. "I want to survive long enough to prove you're making a mistake. By choosing you, by thinking this trial changes anything." The air between them went still. Vaelor studied her for a long moment. "Why did you really accept the trial?" Serena didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice carried the kind of exhaustion that came from years of being invisible. "Because I spent my entire life watching incompetent people inherit power while competent people died forgotten. And I got tired of pretending that was normal." Vaelor felt something crack inside him, because she'd just articulated the exact rage that had been burning inside him for 12 years. "You're going to die if you stay," he said quietly. Serena smiled, but it wasn't warm. "I was already dying. At least this way, it means something." They stood there in the firelight, two people who'd spent their entire lives surviving systems designed to crush anyone who didn't fit. And for the first time in years, Vaelor felt like someone actually saw him instead of the crown. And that was more dangerous than any assassination attempt could ever be. Because the moment a king started hoping someone understood him, he started making decisions based on something other than survival. And decisions made from hope always ended in betrayal. Always. But as Serena turned to leave and Vaelor watched her walk back toward a palace full of people who wanted her dead, he realized something terrifying. He was going to protect her anyway. Not because it was strategic, not because it served the Empire, because for the first time in 12 years, he wanted someone to survive more than he wanted to survive himself. And that meant he'd already lost control. The question now was whether losing control led to evolution or collapse. Either way, the Dominion was about to find out what happened when an Alpha King stopped choosing fear and started choosing truth, even if truth burned everything to ash. The second trial was announced at dawn, and by the time the sun cleared the eastern mountains, half the palace knew someone was going to die before nightfall. Vaelor stood in the war chambers beneath Stormfire Palace, surrounded by maps that covered entire walls like skin stripped from conquered territories. Red markers indicated rebellions crushed. Gold lines traced trade routes maintained through strategic violence. Black pins marked cities that no longer existed because they'd chosen defiance over surrender. 12 years of conquest reduced to colored markers on parchment. 12 years of decisions made in rooms like this, where morality got sacrificed for stability and stability got maintained through calculated cruelty. General Cade entered through the iron door, his boots echoing on stone floors that had witnessed more strategic brutality than most battlefields ever saw. "The candidates are assembled," he said quietly. "All of them?" 10 remain. Lady Alira withdrew last night, said her father received threats explicit enough to make participation suicidal. Smart man. Cade crossed his arms, and his scarred knuckles caught the torchlight in a way that reminded Vaelor how many times those hands had pulled him out of situations where being king wasn't enough to guarantee survival. "The servant girl is still here." "Of course she is. You sound pleased." Vaelor didn't respond immediately, because the truth was complicated in ways he didn't want to examine too closely. Pleased wasn't the right word. Relieved felt more accurate, which was infinitely more dangerous because relief implied investment, and investment implied caring about outcomes beyond strategic necessity. He'd spent 12 years teaching himself not to care about anything except survival. And now some archivist with sharp eyes and sharper words was dismantling that discipline one honest answer at a time. "Send them down," Vaelor said finally. "Your Majesty, about the trial itself." "What about it?" Cade hesitated, which was never a good sign because hesitation from a man who'd fought beside him through 17 major campaigns meant the concern was legitimate. "The invasion plan you're asking them to evaluate. It's the Korvax strategy, the one you proposed 3 years ago that the Council rejected." "I remember. If any of them figures out it's your plan and dismantles it publicly, it undermines your authority in front of the military command." Vaelor turned toward him, and his amber eyes carried the kind of cold certainty that made even loyal generals reconsider whether honesty was worth the professional risk. "Good. Let them dismantle it. Let them prove that strategy matters more than ego. If they can't identify a flawed plan just because a king proposed it, they don't deserve to stand beside me. And if they do identify it, then I'll finally have proof that someone in this empire values truth over political survival." The door opened again, and the candidates filed into the war chamber wearing expressions that ranged from confident ambition to barely concealed terror. War chambers had that effect on people who'd never seen what happened when strategy met reality and reality won. Lady Nicera entered first, wearing black leather armor that matched her house colors, dark hair pulled into a severe braid that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. She moved like someone who'd spent time around military planning, and her eyes scanned the maps with the focused intensity of a tactician identifying advantages. Behind her came Lady Ceres Thane, daughter of the Eastern Fleet Commander, built like someone who actually understood physical combat instead of just theorizing about it. Broader shoulders, calloused hands, and a scar across her left cheek that suggested she'd earned respect instead of inheriting it. And at the back, wearing the same simple black dress she'd worn since the beginning, Serena Vail walked in like she'd been invited to a funeral and already knew whose. No armor, no weapons, Just observation. Vaelor watched her scan the chamber, watched her eyes move across the maps and military diagrams with the kind of systematic assessment that came from years of organizing information nobody else bothered to preserve. Archives taught you to see patterns. They taught you that empires left paper trails, and paper trails revealed intentions long before armies marched. He wondered what patterns she was seeing now. The candidates arranged themselves in a semicircle facing the main strategic table, where a map of the southern territories lay spread across dark wood like a dissection waiting to happen. Red markers indicated the proposed invasion route into Corvax, a neighboring kingdom that had grown wealthy through neutral trade policies and strategic diplomacy instead of military expansion. Vaelor stepped forward, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop with the movement. The Dominion's southern border shares 200 miles with the Kingdom of Corvax, he began, his voice carrying the flat tactical precision of someone describing weather patterns instead of potential mass casualties. For 8 years, they've maintained profitable trade while refusing formal alliance. Intelligence suggests they're negotiating secretly with the Western Coalition, which means they're hedging against our expansion. He gestured toward the map. Before you is a proposed invasion plan. 3-front assault, naval blockade of their eastern ports, ground forces through the mountain passes, strategic occupation of their capital within 30 days. Vaelor paused, letting the weight of it settle. Your task is simple. Evaluate this strategy. Tell me whether conquest serves the Empire's interests. And if you identify flaws, explain them in terms that would convince military commanders to abandon the campaign. Lady Nicera stepped forward immediately, her confidence suggesting she'd prepared for exactly this scenario. The strategy is sound, Your Majesty. Corvax's neutrality makes them unpredictable. Conquest eliminates uncertainty and secures the southern border permanently. The 3-front approach prevents retreat and forces rapid surrender. Vaelor's expression didn't change. Others? Lady Saris moved closer to the map, tracing the proposed routes with one scarred finger. Logistics favor aggression. The mountain passes are only accessible 4 months per year. If we delay, winter closes the window and they gain time to fortify or seek outside intervention. Strike now, strike hard, end it fast. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the remaining candidates. Tactical consensus. Exactly what Vaelor expected from people trained to see conquest as the default solution to geopolitical complexity. He turned toward Serena, who hadn't moved from her position at the back of the chamber. And you? Serena didn't approach the table, didn't study the maps. She looked directly at Vaelor instead, and her voice carried the kind of calm that came from being absolutely certain you were about to make powerful people very angry. This is a terrible plan. The room went silent. Lady Nicera turned slowly, her dark eyes promising violence. Excuse me? Serena finally stepped forward, moving past the other candidates until she stood directly in front of the strategic table. She studied the map for maybe 10 seconds before looking back at Vaelor. You're proposing to conquer territory you already control through economic dependency and strategic fear. Corvax trades with us because refusing would be suicidal. They negotiate with the Western Coalition because hedging is survival strategy, not betrayal. You don't need to invade them. You need them to believe invasion is imminent, which keeps them compliant without the cost of occupation. She gestured toward the red markers. But let's say you invade anyway. 3-front assault works tactically but fails strategically. You'll win the war in 30 days and lose the peace for the next 30 years. Corvax has no history of territorial aggression. Conquering them transforms a neutral trading partner into permanent occupation cost. Every soldier stationed there is one less soldier defending borders that actually matter. Every gold piece spent maintaining control is one less piece available for infrastructure, trade, or preventing the rebellions that emerge when empires stretch resources too thin. Lady Nicera's jaw tightened. You're advocating appeasement. I'm advocating strategy over ego. Serena turned back toward Vaelor, and her eyes carried something dangerous that looked uncomfortably close to disappointment. You're trying to conquer territory because expansion feels like strength, but real strength is knowing when conquest costs more than it gains. Fear wins obedience. It never wins loyalty. And empires that rely entirely on fear eventually collapse under the weight of maintaining terror. The silence that followed was so absolute that Vaelor could hear his own heartbeat echoing against the stone walls. Because Serena had just done something nobody in the Dominion had managed in 12 years. She'd looked at a plan proposed by the Alpha King himself and called it exactly what it was: a mistake dressed as strategy, an ego pretending to be necessity, and she'd done it in front of his entire military command without hesitation or political cushioning. General Cade stood frozen near the door, hand resting on his sword pommel, clearly calculating whether this constituted treason serious enough to require immediate intervention. Lady Nicera stepped closer to Serena, and her voice dropped into something cold enough to frost metal. You just accused the king of planning an invasion driven by pride instead of strategy. That's treason. Serena didn't break eye contact with Vaelor. He asked for honest evaluation. If honesty constitutes treason, then the trial was never about finding someone strong enough to rule. It was about finding someone obedient enough to agree. Vaelor felt something crack inside him. Not anger, recognition. Because 3 years ago, when he'd proposed the Korvax invasion to the council, they'd approved it unanimously, despite the obvious strategic flaws. And he'd withdrawn it anyway because he realized they were agreeing out of fear instead of conviction. And he'd spent the last 3 years wondering whether anyone in the Empire would ever value truth over self-preservation. Now he had his answer. He moved towards Serena slowly, deliberately, and the other candidates backed away instinctively because they recognized predator movement when they saw it. But Serena held her ground. You think I proposed this plan because of ego, Vaelor said quietly. I think you proposed it to see who would have the spine to tell you it was wrong. The air between them went still. And if you're wrong, if I actually intended to invade, Serena's voice didn't waver, then you're a worse strategist than I thought, and this empire is already dying. It just hasn't realized it yet. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the war chamber moved. Then Vaelor smiled. Not the political smile he used during ceremonies, not the cold smile that preceded executions, a real smile. Small and dangerous, and carrying the weight of 12 years' worth of exhaustion, pretending to be strength. You're right, he said quietly. The plan is flawed. I proposed it 3 years ago. The council approved it unanimously. I withdrew it because I realized they were agreeing out of fear instead of strategic assessment. He turned toward the other candidates. You all failed. You evaluated tactics without questioning strategic necessity. You prioritized aggression because aggression feels like strength, and none of you asked the one question that actually matters. Vaelor's voice grew colder. Why are we invading? He gestured towards Serena. She asked. She identified the flaw. She prioritized the Empire's long-term survival over the appearance of decisive leadership. Lady Nicera's face went pale with rage. This is madness. You're elevating a servant over noble-born candidates because she criticized you in public? No, Vaelor said. I'm elevating the only person in this room who understood that real power isn't about dominating everyone around you. It's about being strong enough to admit when domination serves ego instead of empire. He turned back towards Serena, and his amber eyes caught the torchlight in a way that made them look almost warm. The second trial is over. You passed. Serena stared at him for a long moment, and Vaelor saw something flicker across her face that looked uncomfortably close to understanding. She saw through him completely, saw the exhaustion, saw the isolation, saw the man trapped inside the monster reputation he'd built to survive, and that terrified him more than any battlefield confrontation ever had. Because being seen meant being vulnerable, and vulnerability was the one thing an Alpha King could never afford. The other candidates filed out of the war chamber in furious silence, leaving only Serena, Vaelor, and Cade standing among the maps of conquered territories. Cade waited exactly 5 seconds before speaking. Your Majesty, we need to discuss— Not now. This is going to start a war. It already started, Vaelor said quietly. We're just deciding whether it's a war over truth or a war over power. Those are the same war. No. Power wars end when someone wins. Truth wars end when someone changes. Cade stared at him like he'd started speaking a language that didn't exist yet. Then he turned and left through the iron door, and his footsteps echoed down the corridor like the sound of loyalty reconsidering its options. Vaelor turned back towards Serena, who was still standing beside the strategic table studying the Korvax invasion plan, like it contained answers to questions she hadn't asked yet. Why did you really propose this trial? she asked without looking at him. You already know why? I know what you told the Empire. I'm asking what you told yourself. Vaelor moved closer, close enough that he could see the exhaustion carved into her face from 3 nights of surviving assassination attempts and political sabotage. I told myself that ruling through fear was survival, that compromise was weakness, that the Empire needed a king strong enough to crush any threat before it could breathe, and I believed that for 12 years. He paused. Then you walked into my throne room and reminded me that strength without purpose is just cruelty wearing a crown. And I got tired of pretending that was enough. Serena finally looked at him, and her eyes carried the kind of understanding that comes from shared exhaustion instead of shared experience. You're going to get me killed. Probably. And you're fine with that? No, Vaelor said quietly. But I'm going to protect you anyway, which makes me weak, which proves you were right about everything. The firelight flickered across the stone walls, casting shadows that looked like ghosts watching them make decisions that would haunt the Empire for generations. You don't need to protect me, Serena said. You need to decide whether this Empire survives through evolution or collapse, because those are the only 2 options left. Vaelor studied her face for a long moment, searching for fear or manipulation or any indication that this was strategy disguised as honesty. He found nothing but truth. And truth was infinitely more dangerous than any conspiracy could ever be. I should send you away, he said, somewhere safe, somewhere the noble houses can't reach you. You won't. How do you know? Because you're not trying to save me. You're trying to prove that honesty can survive in a system built to crush it. And if you send me away, you'll never know whether you were right. She moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back. The 3rd trial. What is it? Vaelor didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried the weight of 12 years' worth of decisions he wished he could unmake. Survival. Mbasol. That night, the palace felt like a tomb waiting for bodies to justify its existence. Vaelor stood in his private chambers overlooking the obsidian cliffs, while storms raged against the tower windows hard enough to crack stone. He'd dismissed his guards hours ago because guards were witnesses, and witnesses meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant targets for people who understood that kings died slowest when you made them watch everyone they cared about bleed first. Not that he cared about anyone. Couldn't afford to. Except he kept thinking about Serena standing in the war chamber dismantling his invasion plan with the kind of precision that comes from actually giving a damn about consequences instead of just winning arguments. And thinking about her meant worrying about her, and worrying meant caring. And caring meant he'd already lost the one battle that mattered most. The door to his chambers opened without knocking, and Vaelor reached for the dagger hidden in his belt before recognizing the footsteps. Cade. Always Cade. The only man in the Empire who'd earned the right to walk into the king's private space without invitation or consequence. We have a problem, Cade said. We have 17 problems. Be specific. Lord Malrek Volkar is calling an emergency session of the Crimson Council. Let him. The council serves at my discretion. Not anymore. He's invoking the sovereign right of challenge. Vaelor went completely still. The sovereign right was ancient law, older than the Dominion itself, written into the original territorial agreements when the first kings unified the wolf clans through blood oaths instead of conquest. It gave noble houses the authority to challenge any royal decree they believed endangered the empire's survival, and it required the king to defend his position before the full council or abdicate. Nobody had invoked it in 4 generations because invoking it was political suicide unless you had overwhelming support, which meant Volkar had overwhelming support, which meant civil war was about to begin. When? Vaelor asked quietly. 3 days. He's gathering allies. By the time the council convenes, he'll have enough houses backing him to force abdication unless you can prove your decisions serve the Empire's interests. And his primary argument? Cade's jaw tightened. That you're compromised. That the servant girl manipulated you through seduction and witchcraft. That choosing her over noble-born candidates proves you're no longer fit to rule. Vaelor turned back toward the window, and his reflection in the storm-battered glass looked like a stranger he'd stopped recognizing years ago. This isn't about Serena. This is about power. Volkar sees weakness, and he's moving to exploit it. Is he wrong? About the weakness? About you being compromised? Vaelor didn't answer immediately because answering meant admitting something he'd spent 3 weeks trying to deny. Finally, he spoke. Yes, I'm compromised. For the first time in 12 years, I actually care whether someone survives. And that makes me vulnerable in ways strategy can't protect against. Cade moved beside him, and they stood there together staring out at the storm like two men watching an empire collapse in real time. What's the play? Cade asked quietly. I defend my decisions before the council. Prove that the trial serves the empire by exposing incompetence hidden behind bloodlines. Force them to choose between tradition and evolution. And if they choose tradition, then I abdicate or they remove me by force. Either way, the Dominion gets the kind of king Volcar represents. Someone who rules through fear and political convenience instead of truth. There was a long silence. You could send her away, Cade said carefully. End the trial. Choose a political marriage. Stabilize the empire before the council convenes. I could. Will you? No. Why not? Because I spent 12 years building an empire through conquest and fear, and it's dying anyway. Maybe slower than it would under weaker leadership, but dying nonetheless. Rebellions keep emerging. Alliances keep fracturing. And every solution I implement just delays collapse instead of preventing it. Vaelor's voice grew quieter. Serena sees that. She understands that empires built only on domination eventually collapse under the weight of maintaining terror. And if there's even a chance that truth survives what's coming, then protecting her matters more than protecting my crown. Cade stared at him. You're in love with her. No. I'm desperate enough to hope she's right. There's a difference. Vaelor didn't answer because he genuinely didn't know anymore. Love required trust, and trust required vulnerability. And vulnerability was the one luxury rulers could never afford because vulnerability meant giving people weapons specifically designed to destroy you. But hope was different. Hope was the dangerous belief that change was possible, that systems built through violence could evolve into systems maintained through conviction. That strength didn't require cruelty. And if Serena represented that hope, then protecting her wasn't about love. It was about protecting the possibility that 12 years of bloodshed might actually lead somewhere other than more bloodshed, even if protecting that possibility destroyed him completely. I need to see her, Vaelor said. Now? Now, Your Majesty. It's past midnight. If anyone sees you visiting her chambers. I'm not visiting her chambers. Bring her to the moon chamber. Quietly. Cade hesitated. This is a mistake. Everything I've done for 3 weeks has been a mistake. One more won't change the outcome. Why? Serena arrived 20 minutes later, escorted by Cade through corridors dark enough to hide movement, but not dark enough to hide intent. She wore the same black dress she'd worn since the trials began, and Vaelor wondered if it was defiance or practicality or just exhaustion disguised as consistency. The moon chamber overlooked the frozen sea, walls lined with black stone and windows tall enough to make you feel like gravity was optional. Candles flickered across surfaces that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, and the whole space felt less like a room and more like a confession chamber designed for truths nobody wanted to speak aloud. Vaelor stood near the window, and he didn't turn when Serena entered. You summoned me, Your Majesty. Her voice carried careful neutrality, which meant she understood exactly how dangerous midnight meetings in private chambers were when half the Empire already believed they were conspiring. Vaelor turned slowly. Lord Volcar is invoking the sovereign right of challenge. 3 days from now, I'll defend my decisions before the Crimson Council or abdicate. Serena's expression didn't change. I know. How? Palace archivists organize information. Information includes whispered conversations in corridors people think are empty. Vaelor almost smiled. What else do archivists know? That you're about to offer me an escape route. Probably safe passage to a neutral territory. Possibly enough gold to start over somewhere the Volcar family can't reach me. She paused. And I'm going to refuse. Vaelor studied her face, searching for the calculation behind the confidence. Why? Because if I leave, you prove Volcar right. That I'm a distraction you can discard when politically convenient. And if you prove him right, the Empire learns that truth only matters when it's comfortable. She moved closer to the window, standing beside him but not touching, both of them staring out at the storm like it contained answers neither wanted to find. You're going to lose this fight, she said quietly. Volcar has the support. The military is divided. The noble houses see me as a threat to the social order that profits their wealth and power. Even if you defend your position brilliantly, they'll remove you anyway. I know. So why keep fighting? Vaelor turned toward her, and for the first time since becoming king, he let exhaustion show on his face without hiding it behind strategy or strength, or the cold authority that made people obey out of fear instead of respect. Because for 12 years I ruled through domination, crushed rebellions, expanded borders, made entire kingdoms kneel voluntarily rather than face annihilation. And it worked. The empire grew, prosperity increased, stability held. He paused. But inside the palace walls, I was dying. One betrayal at a time, one political compromise at a time. One decision that prioritized survival over sanity at a time. And I realized that ruling an empire meant eventually choosing between power and humanity. His amber eyes caught the candlelight. I chose power. For 12 years. And it cost me everything that made power worth having. Serena held his gaze without speaking. Then you walked into my throne room and reminded me that strength without purpose is just cruelty wearing a crown. And I got tired of pretending that was enough. So this isn't about me, Serena said softly. This is about you trying to prove that 12 years of bloodshed led somewhere other than more bloodshed. Yes. And if it didn't? If you lose everything and nothing changes, then at least I'll lose honestly instead of surviving dishonestly. They stood there under the candlelight, two people who'd spent their entire lives navigating systems designed to crush anyone who refused to play by rules written to favor people who inherited power instead of earning it. And for the first time in years, Vaelor felt like someone actually understood what it cost to keep fighting when fighting was all you had left. The third trial, Serena said. You told me it was survival. It is. Whose survival? Mine or yours? Vaelor didn't answer immediately because answering meant admitting something that would make him vulnerable in ways strategy couldn't protect against. Finally, he spoke. Both. Bakyan. The Crimson Council convened 3 days later inside the Grand Hall of Judgment, and the atmosphere felt less like a political gathering and more like an execution chamber waiting for someone to make the mistake that justified violence. Thousands filled the tiered seats rising toward vaulted ceilings, carved with wolf sigils that watched from above like predators deciding which prey deserved culling. Every noble house across the Dominion sent representatives, wearing ceremonial armor and expressions that promised this gathering would end in either political revolution or physical bloodshed. At the center of the hall, elevated on a platform of black stone, sat the Circle of Judgment, where 12 senior lords would hear arguments and render verdict on whether the Alpha King's decisions served the Empire or endangered it. Lord Malrek Volcar stood at the prosecution position, wearing silver ceremonial armor that caught the torchlight like knives waiting to cut. 60 years old, scarred face, dark eyes, carrying the kind of calculated fury that came from decades of commanding armies, and believing power was measured by body count instead of loyalty. Beside him stood Lady Nicera, his daughter, wearing crimson silk and the expression of someone who'd bet everything on this outcome and refused to consider what losing meant. Across the chamber, Vaelor stood alone at the defense position wearing black armor and the crown of ash that felt heavier than usual, because crowns always felt heaviest right before they got removed. Cade stood near the eastern wall with a contingent of loyal guards, hand resting on his sword pommel, clearly calculating how many seconds it would take for this political trial to become actual warfare. And in the gallery reserved for witnesses, wearing the same black dress she'd worn since the beginning, Serena Vael sat surrounded by nobles, who looked at her like she was a disease they couldn't cure fast enough. The head arbiter, Lord Chancellor Oren Gravet, stepped forward and raised his hands for silence. The hall obeyed immediately. "We gather under the sovereign right of challenge," Oren announced, his voice echoing across marble floors like judgment itself. Lord Malrek Volcar accuses King Vaelor Draven of compromised leadership endangering the Dominion's survival. The charges are threefold. He paused for effect. First, abandoning traditional succession protocols by implementing the trial of Dominion against council advisement. Second, elevating a low-born candidate over noble bloodlines, undermining social order and political stability. Third, allowing personal attachment to compromise strategic decision-making. Oren turned toward Volcar. "Present your case." Volcar stepped forward, and his voice carried the kind of absolute conviction that came from believing your own propaganda. For 12 years, King Vaelor ruled through strength, discipline, and unwavering commitment to Dominion supremacy. He crushed rebellions, expanded borders, and made rival kingdoms kneel through strategic dominance. The empire prospered under his iron will. He gestured dramatically toward Vaelor. But 3 weeks ago, something changed. A servant girl challenged tradition by accepting a trial she had no right to enter. And instead of dismissing her appropriately, the king elevated her, gave her platform, made her visible. Volcar's voice grew colder. And in doing so, he revealed weakness. Because strong kings don't need to prove their decisions are correct. They simply make decisions and enforce them. The moment a king starts seeking validation from subordinates is the moment subordinates start questioning authority. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Volcar continued. The trial of Dominion isn't about finding a qualified Luna. It's about the king announcing he no longer trusts the system that elevated him, that he values this girl's opinion over centuries of tradition and noble wisdom, that he's compromised by attachment instead of guided by empire necessity. He turned toward the circle of judgment. A compromised king is a dangerous king, and dangerous kings invite chaos. I invoke the sovereign right not out of personal ambition, but out of loyalty to an empire that deserves leadership untainted by weakness. The hall erupted into applause that sounded less like agreement and more like violence waiting for permission. Orin raised his hands again for silence, then turned toward Vaelor. Your defense, Your Majesty. Vaelor stood quietly for a long moment, letting the noise settle, letting the tension build until every person in the hall was leaning forward, waiting for words that would either save or destroy him. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the kind of cold precision that had ended arguments for 12 years. Lord Volcar accuses me of weakness because I implemented a trial that tests competence instead of rewarding bloodlines. Let me be clear about what that actually means. He stepped forward. For 12 years, I ruled through fear, crushed rebellions before they could organize, expanded borders until rival kingdoms surrendered voluntarily, built an empire maintained through strategic violence and political dominance. And it worked. Prosperity increased, stability held. The Dominion became the most powerful force in the known world. Vaelor's amber eyes swept across the crowd. But empires built only on fear eventually collapse. Not because fear fails, because maintaining fear requires constant escalation. Every rebellion crushed creates 2 more waiting to emerge. Every kingdom conquered creates occupation costs that drain resources. Every alliance forced through intimidation creates resentment that waits for opportunity. He paused. I implemented the trial of Dominion because traditional succession protocols prioritize political convenience over competence. They reward people who inherited titles instead of people who earned capability. And after 12 years of watching noble-born candidates fail basic strategic assessments while servants demonstrate genuine leadership, I decided truth mattered more than tradition. The hall went quiet. Lord Volcar argues that seeking validation from subordinates reveals weakness. I argue that refusing to question your own decisions reveals arrogance. And arrogance kills empires faster than external threats ever could. Vaelor turned toward Serena, and his voice grew softer but no less intense. The woman you dismiss as a servant challenged my invasion plan by identifying fatal strategic flaws that every military commander in this room missed because they were too afraid to contradict me. She prioritized empire survival over political advancement. She spoke truth when silence would have been safer. He looked back at the circle of judgment. If that's weakness, then strength is worthless. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Lord Volcar stepped forward again, and his voice dripped with calculated fury. Beautiful words, Your Majesty, but words don't change reality. You claim this trial tests competence, but you've already decided the outcome. You claim you value truth, but you only value truth that confirms your preference. And you claim attachment doesn't compromise judgment, but everyone in this hall knows you've already chosen her. He pointed directly at Serena. This isn't about evolution. This is about a king who got lonely and mistook connection for strength. And empires that elevate sentiment over strategy don't survive. Volcar turned back toward the circle. I call for immediate abdication. The king has proven himself compromised. The empire deserves leadership untainted by weakness. The hall erupted into chaos. Half the nobles shouted agreement. Half shouted opposition. And somewhere in that chaos, Vaelor realized there was no path backward. If he defended his position, civil war would begin. If he abdicated, everything he'd tried to prove would die. And if he admitted attachment compromised judgment, he'd become exactly the monster the Empire always believed him to be. So he did the one thing nobody expected. He removed the crown of ash from his head, walked across the platform, and placed it directly into Serena's hands before the entire Dominion. The hall went silent, dead silent. The kind of silence that preceded either revolution or massacre. Vaelor turned back toward the circle of judgment, and his voice carried absolute finality. I built this kingdom through conquest, but conquest alone cannot preserve it. You call her dangerous because she threatens the social order that profits your greed and incompetence. Good. Then let the Empire change. His amber eyes swept across the terrified nobles. I abdicate to no one. But I grant full authority to the woman who proved that truth survives when everyone else chooses comfortable lies. And at that exact moment, Lord Volcar drew steel. Steel scraped against leather as Lord Volcar drew his blade, and the sound echoed through the grand hall of judgment like the first crack in ice before the whole frozen lake collapsed beneath you. For one impossible second, nobody moved. Not because they were shocked, because they were calculating. Calculating whether drawing steel against the Alpha King in the most sacred political chamber in the Dominion constituted justified rebellion or suicidal treason. Calculating whether supporting Volcar meant aligning with revolution or backing a doomed conspiracy. Calculating whether the empire they'd spent lifetimes navigating was about to fracture into civil war, or whether this was just theater that would resolve itself through political compromise and strategic executions. That second ended when 36 nobles wearing Volcar house colors stood simultaneously, hands moving toward concealed weapons, and the grand hall transformed from political theater into a killing floor. Vaelor didn't reach for his sword, didn't call for guards. He stood there on this platform with the crown of ash still in Serena's hands, watching the empire he'd built through 12 years of conquest and careful brutality begin tearing itself apart. And the only thought running through his mind was brutally simple. This was always going to happen. Not today specifically, but eventually. Because empires built through domination always ended the same way. The strong ruled until someone stronger emerged. And strength was just violence waiting for better timing. General Cade moved first, drawing his sword and positioning himself between Vaelor and the approaching nobles with the kind of lethal efficiency that came from 2 decades of keeping kings alive through situations where protocol stopped mattering and survival became the only strategy worth pursuing. "Stand down!" Cade's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through ceremony. "All of you! Drawing steel in the council chamber is treason punishable by—" Lord Volcar laughed, and the sound carried genuine amusement instead of political theater. "Treason? We're preventing treason. The king just abdicated authority to a servant girl. He compromised the throne. We're restoring order." He stepped forward, blade raised, and his eyes locked on Vaelor with the kind of cold certainty that came from believing your own justifications. "You had 12 years, Vaelor. 12 years to choose strength over sentiment, to maintain the empire through the discipline that built it. But you got weak. You let her poison your judgment, and weak kings don't survive." Vaelor still didn't draw his weapon. He stood there watching Volcar approach, watching the nobles who'd spent years smiling to his face while sharpening knives behind his back finally reveal themselves. And something shifted inside him. Not fear, clarity. The brutal, exhausted clarity that comes from realizing you've been fighting the wrong war the entire time. "You think this is about weakness," Vaelor said quietly. "But it's not. It's about you finally seeing an opportunity to take what you've wanted since the day I took this throne." Volcar's smile widened. "And what's that?" "Power without accountability. The authority to rule without anyone questioning whether your decisions serve the empire or just serve your ambition. You don't want a strong king. You want a dead one so you can install someone controllable." The truth hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Then chaos erupted. Nobles loyal to Volcar surged forward. Guards loyal to Vaelor moved to intercept. Steel clashed against steel as the Grand Hall transformed into a battlefield where political alliances got tested through actual violence instead of verbal maneuvering. Cade fought like a siege weapon designed specifically for killing people in confined spaces. his blade moving with the kind of brutal efficiency that came from understanding that survival in close quarters meant eliminating threats before they could coordinate. But there were too many conspirators, too many nobles who'd spent years waiting for exactly this moment. And in the chaos, Vaelor finally saw the truth he'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. This wasn't about Serena. This was about him. About the fact that 12 years of ruling through fear had created an empire where everyone was just waiting for the moment fear stopped working. Where loyalty was just obedience wearing a prettier mask. Where power attracted people who wanted to exploit it, not serve it. And he'd been so focused on survival that he'd forgotten to ask whether survival alone was worth the cost. A blade came at him from the left. Vaelor moved, finally drawing his sword, and the muscle memory from 2 decades of warfare took over. He blocked, countered, struck, and the attacker fell bleeding across marble floors that had witnessed more political violence in 5 minutes than most battlefields saw in months. But even while fighting, Vaelor's eyes tracked Serena. She'd moved toward the gallery exit the moment steel was drawn, still holding the crown of ash, moving with the kind of systematic calm that suggested she'd already calculated the optimal escape route before the trial even began. Smart. Always smart. But 3 nobles wearing Volcar colors blocked her path, and Vaelor watched her realize she was trapped between execution and capture. He moved without thinking, crossed the chamber in seconds, cutting through conspirators with the kind of savage precision that came from fighting when strategy stopped mattering and only momentum kept you alive. He reached Serena, grabbed her arm, and pulled her toward the eastern corridor where Cade had cleared a temporary path through the chaos. "Move," he said. Serena didn't argue. They ran. Behind them, the Grand Hall burned with violence that would reshape the Dominion's political landscape for generations, and ahead of them lay corridors that might contain escape or might just contain different forms of death. Either way, running was the only option that kept breathing possible. Mak. They made it to the moon chamber because muscle memory guided Vaelor through palace corridors he'd walked for 12 years, and because Cade and his loyal guards bought them time by turning the Grand Hall into a slaughterhouse that would haunt survivors forever. Vaelor slammed the chamber door shut and shoved the iron locking bar into place while his lungs burned and his hands shook from adrenaline that hadn't worn off yet. Serena stood near the window overlooking the frozen sea, still holding the crown of ash, and her face carried the kind of cold assessment that came from watching your entire reality collapse and forcing yourself to process it strategically instead of emotionally. "That was a coup," she said quietly. "Not a challenge, not a trial. A planned coup." Vaelor moved to the weapon cache hidden behind false stonework near the eastern wall. He pulled out daggers, a crossbow, spare sword, and started loading everything within reach because trapped kings who ran out of weapons became dead kings within minutes. "I know. You knew before the trial started. I suspected. Couldn't prove it until they moved." He tossed her a dagger. "Can you use that?" Serena caught it and tested the weight with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested archives weren't her only education. "I can try not to die immediately." "That count?" "Good enough." Vaelor moved to the window and looked out at Stormfire Palace sprawling across the obsidian cliffs like a fortress designed by paranoid gods who understood that beauty and defensibility were the same thing if you built walls thick enough. Smoke rose from the Grand Hall. Fires were spreading. And in the courtyards below, he could see soldiers gathering in formations that suggested loyalty was being tested through immediate violence rather than gradual political maneuvering. "How many do you think stayed loyal?" Serena asked. "To me? Maybe 40% of the military. Cade commands respect, and respect buys temporary loyalty. But loyalty without victory dies fast. And the noble houses? Most will back whoever wins. That's how noble houses survive. They don't pick sides until sides are already decided." "So what's the play?" Vaelor turned away from the window, and his amber eyes carried the kind of exhausted calculation that came from playing survival games for so long that winning and losing stopped meaning anything except delayed consequences. "There is no play. Volcar controls the council chamber, which means he controls the symbolic center of power. He's probably declaring me dead or abdicated right now, installing himself as regent, consolidating authority before opposition can organize." Serena stared at him. So we just hide here and hope they don't find us? No. We use the tunnels beneath the palace to reach the eastern armory, where Cade will rally whatever forces remain loyal. Then we evacuate to the frontier fortresses and prepare for civil war. He paused. Or I abdicate legitimately, we escape separately, and you disappear before Volcar can execute you for political symbolism. Serena's jaw tightened. I'm not running. You should. This isn't your fight. You made it my fight the moment you put that crown in my hands in front of the entire empire. If I run now, I prove Volcar right. That I'm just a distraction. That truth only matters when it's safe. Vaelor moved closer to her, close enough that he could see the exhaustion carved into her face from 3 weeks of surviving assassination attempts, political sabotage, and now actual warfare. Truth doesn't matter if you're dead. Serena held his gaze. And power doesn't matter if you're alone. The words hit harder than any blade could have, because she'd just articulated the one truth Vaelor had spent 12 years trying to avoid. He'd built an empire through conquest and fear, surrounded himself with guards and generals and political advisors, ruled over millions of people across conquered territories, and he'd never been more alone in his entire life. Because power attracted loyalty that evaporated the moment power looked vulnerable. Because strength attracted allies who disappeared the moment strength looked defeatable. Because ruling through fear meant everyone around you was just waiting for fear to stop working so they could finally settle scores you didn't even know existed. And the only person who'd walked into his throne room and refused to play that game was standing in front of him, holding a crown she never asked for and refusing to run from consequences that weren't hers to face. Which meant either she was the stupidest person he'd ever met or the bravest. Or possibly both. The door to the moon chamber exploded inward before Vaelor could respond. Iron locking bars shattered by something that sounded like battering rams combined with explosive charges, and 5 armored soldiers wearing Volcar house colors poured through the opening with crossbows raised and expressions that promised execution was imminent. Vaelor moved instantly, throwing himself in front of Serena as bolts whistled through the air close enough that he felt wind displacement against his face. He drew his sword and charged before they could reload, closing distance because crossbows were devastating at range and worthless in close quarters. His blade caught the first soldier across the throat. The second tried to block and died badly. The third got his crossbow raised, but Vaelor was already inside his guard, and close-range combat was about violence of action instead of technique. 4 seconds, 3 dead. 2 remaining soldiers backed toward the doorway, and Vaelor saw the calculation in their eyes shifting from execution detail to survival mode. Then Serena screamed. Not fear. Warning. Vaelor spun and saw General Cade standing in the doorway, sword drawn, armor scorched from recent combat, and his face carrying an expression Vaelor had never seen in 2 decades of fighting beside him. Regret. Cold, terrible regret. And Vaelor understood immediately. Cade had betrayed him. Not during the coup. Before. Long before. Probably years before. The realization hit like a physical blow, and Vaelor actually staggered backward because betrayal from enemies was expected, but betrayal from the one man you trusted absolutely was the kind of wound that didn't kill you fast enough to prevent suffering. Cade stepped into the chamber, and the 2 remaining soldiers moved aside to let him pass with the kind of deference that confirmed he was commanding this operation, not just participating in it. When? Vaelor's voice came out flat. Empty. When did you turn? Cade's jaw tightened, but he didn't lower his sword. 3 years ago. After you withdrew the Korvax invasion, after I realized you were losing the discipline that built this empire. 3 years. 3 years of fake loyalty. 3 years of standing beside him in strategy sessions, protecting him during assassination attempts, offering counsel that probably steered him toward exactly this outcome. 3 years of comprehensive, calculated betrayal by the one person Vaelor believed was incapable of it. You could have killed me any time, Vaelor said quietly. Why wait? Because killing you made me a traitor. Waiting for you to compromise yourself made me a patriot. Cade gestured toward Serena with his blade. She was the perfect catalyst. Low-born. Competent enough to appeal to your exhaustion. Honest enough to make you believe change was possible. You did exactly what we predicted. You elevated her, defended her, and proved to the entire empire that sentiment had compromised your judgment. Vaelor felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with physical injury. We. You said we. Cade nodded slowly. Volkar and I have been planning this for 3 years. He provides the political weight. I provide military legitimacy. Together, we restore the Empire to what it was before you started questioning whether domination was the only form of strength. The betrayal was so comprehensive, so carefully orchestrated, that Vaelor actually laughed. Not from amusement. From the brutal recognition that he'd been playing a game where the rules were rigged from the beginning and he'd been too focused on surviving to notice. So this was always the plan, Vaelor said. The trial, the challenge, the coup. All of it designed to force me into a position where defending my decisions looked like weakness. Cade's expression didn't change. You made it easy. The moment you cared about her survival more than Empire stability, you stopped being fit to rule. He raised his sword. I'm sorry it ended this way. I genuinely am. You were a great king. But great kings know when power requires sacrifice. And you stopped being willing to sacrifice the things that mattered. Vaelor's grip tightened on his sword, and his mind raced through tactical options that all ended the same way. He was wounded, exhausted, outnumbered, and fighting the one man who knew every combat technique he'd ever learned because they'd trained together for 20 years. There was no version of this where he won, but there might be a version where Serena survived. He glanced at her and their eyes met for half a second, and something unspoken passed between them. An understanding built from 3 weeks of navigating impossible situations together. Run when I move. Serena's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded once. Vaelor turned back toward Cade, and his voice carried the kind of cold finality that came from accepting there was no path forward except the brutal one. You're right. I stopped being willing to sacrifice the things that mattered, because I finally figured out that power without purpose is just cruelty wearing a crown. And if that makes me unfit to rule, then this empire deserves exactly what it's going to get under you and Volkar. He raised his sword. Good luck maintaining an empire built on fear. You're going to need it. Then Vaelor charged, not toward Cade, toward the soldiers blocking the doorway. It was suicide tactics and everyone in the chamber knew it, but suicide tactics bought time when time was the only currency worth spending. Vaelor crashed into the first soldier with enough force to knock him backward into the corridor. The second soldier tried to block, but Vaelor was already moving, already cutting, already forcing them to engage instead of thinking about the servant girl running toward the window. Behind him, he heard glass shatter, heard Serena scream something that might have been his name or might have been something else entirely. Then he felt Cade's blade punch through his lower back, angled upward toward vital organs, and the pain was so immediate and overwhelming that his legs stopped working and he collapsed onto stone floors that suddenly felt very cold. Cade stood over him, and his face carried genuine sorrow that made the betrayal somehow worse because at least hate was honest. I'm sorry, Cade said quietly. I truly am. Vaelor coughed blood onto marble floors that had witnessed more violence in one day than most battlefields saw in years. The girl? She jumped. 70-foot drop into the sea. Nobody survives that. Vaelor closed his eyes, and despite the pain radiating through his entire body, despite the knowledge that he was bleeding out in a chamber where he'd made some of the most important decisions of his reign, he felt something unexpected. Relief. Because if Serena jumped, she might survive. Might disappear into territories where Volkar's authority was still contested. Might become the living proof that truth could survive even when the systems designed to crush it won. And if she survived, then maybe his 12 years of bloodshed had led somewhere other than just more bloodshed. Maybe change was possible after all, even if he wouldn't live to see it. Cade knelt beside him, and his voice was gentle in a way that made everything worse. Any last words? Vaelor opened his eyes and met Cade's gaze with what remained of his strength. You're going to lose. Not today, not next month, but eventually. Because empires built only on fear always collapse under the weight of maintaining terror. And when this one collapses, I hope you remember that I tried to tell you there was another way. Cade's jaw tightened. Then he stood and walked out of the chamber, leaving Vaelor bleeding on the floor like discarded strategy that no longer served anyone's interests. The last thing Vaelor saw before consciousness faded was moonlight streaming through the shattered window where Serena had jumped, and he wondered if she was already dead or if she was swimming toward shore in freezing water that would kill her slowly instead of quickly. Either way, she was free. and freedom was the only thing worth dying for. Vaelor woke to pain so absolute that for several seconds he couldn't remember his own name. Then memory crashed back like a physical blow. The coup, the betrayal, Cade's sword punching through his back, Serena jumping through the window. He tried to move and discovered his arms were chained to stone walls in a cell that smelled like old blood and political executions. Torchlight flickered across wet stone, and somewhere in the distance he could hear screaming that suggested interrogations were happening in adjacent chambers. How long had he been unconscious? Hours? Days? The wound in his back throbbed with the kind of deep ache that suggested infection was already setting in, and his mouth tasted like copper and failure. The cell door opened, and Lord Volcar entered wearing the crown of ash, like it had always belonged to him, which it probably had in his mind because men like Volcar believed power was something you took rather than something you earned. He pulled a chair across the cell floor, the scraping sound echoing like nails on slate, and sat down just outside Vaelor's reach. "You're awake." "Good. I was worried you'd die before we could have this conversation." Vaelor's voice came out rough, damaged. "What conversation?" "You already won." Volcar smiled, and it was the kind of smile that preceded torture disguised as negotiation. "Not quite. See, you're still alive, which means technically you haven't abdicated. And as long as you're alive, there's a faction of soldiers and nobles who still consider you the legitimate king, which creates instability." He leaned forward. "So here's the offer. You sign a formal abdication, transfer all authority to the council with me as regent, publicly endorse the transition as necessary for empire stability, and in exchange, I let you live. Quiet exile in some frontier territory where you can spend the rest of your life remembering what it felt like to be powerful." Vaelor stared at him, and despite the pain, despite the chains, despite the comprehensive destruction of everything he'd built, he felt something unexpected: anger. Pure, clarifying anger. Not at Volcar, at himself. For spending 12 years believing that ruling through fear was survival when it was really just slow death with political authority attached. Volcar mistook the silence for consideration. The alternative is execution. Public. Ceremonial. Designed to erase any remaining loyalty to your memory. I'd prefer the first option because it's cleaner, but I'll settle for the second if necessary. Vaelor coughed blood, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of exhausted honesty that came from having nothing left to lose. "You think this is about power, but it's not. It's about the fact that you're terrified. Terrified that I was right, that empires maintained only through fear eventually collapse, that strength without purpose is just cruelty that stops working the moment people stop being afraid." Volcar's smile faded. "You think exiling me prevents instability? It guarantees it. Because every soldier who fought beside me, every noble who respected competence over bloodline, every frontier village that prospered under policies that prioritized people over politics, they're all going to remember that you removed a king who was trying to evolve the empire and replaced him with a regent who wants to restore the exact system that was already failing." Vaelor leaned forward as much as the chains allowed. "You didn't win, Volcar. You just delayed collapse by removing the one person trying to prevent it." Volcar stood slowly, and his face carried cold fury that promised suffering was about to become tactical instead of incidental. "Then I'll make sure your exile is public enough that everyone understands what happens to kings who prioritize sentiment over strength." He moved toward the door, then stopped and looked back. The servant girl. Serena. She didn't survive the fall. We found her body this morning washed up on the rocks below the eastern cliffs. "Thought you'd want to know." The words hit like a physical blow, and Vaelor felt something inside him that had been barely holding together finally shatter completely. Serena was dead. The one person who'd walked into his throne room and refused to play games designed to reward manipulation over honesty was dead because he'd been stupid enough to believe that truth could survive in a system built to crush it. And he'd gotten her killed by caring about her survival more than he'd cared about his own. Volcar left the cell, and the door slammed shut with a finality that sounded like the empire itself closing. Vaelor hung there in chains, bleeding and broken and alone. And for the first time in 12 years, he let himself feel the full weight of what ruling had cost. Not the political costs, not the strategic sacrifices, the human costs. The slow erosion of everything that made power worth having in exchange for the authority to maintain systems that served nobody except the people benefiting from maintaining them. He'd spent 12 years teaching himself not to care because caring made you vulnerable. And the moment he'd finally started caring again, everyone he cared about died or betrayed him, which meant Volcar was right. Sentiment was weakness, and weakness got you chained to walls and cells that smelled like failure while empires moved forward without you. Vaelor closed his eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like. Couldn't. All he felt was exhaustion pretending to be acceptance. And somewhere deep in that exhaustion, he made a decision. He was done trying to save an empire that didn't want to be saved. Done believing that truth mattered in systems built to reward lies. Done pretending that evolution was possible when collapse was inevitable. If Volcar wanted him to sign abdication papers, he'd sign them. If exile was the price of ending this nightmare, he'd pay it. Because fighting for 12 years had gotten him nothing except betrayal and loss, and the knowledge that power without purpose was just prolonged suffering wearing a crown. And he was tired of suffering. So tired. The cell door opened again hours later, but it wasn't Volcar who entered. It was Cade, wearing the expression of a man who'd made irreversible decisions and was now living with consequences he couldn't change. He knelt beside Vaelor and unlocked the chains without speaking. Vaelor's arms dropped, and pain shot through his shoulders from hours of supporting his weight. "Why are you here?" Vaelor asked. Cade didn't meet his eyes. "Because Volcar ordered me to prepare you for transport to the frontier. Exile begins at dawn." So that's it. 12 years erased by bureaucratic efficiency. Cade finally looked at him, and his face carried genuine regret that made nothing better. "I didn't want it to end this way." Vaelor laughed, but it came out broken. "You spent 3 years planning exactly this ending. Don't pretend regret changes anything." He stood slowly, legs shaking, back screaming, and faced the man he'd trusted more than anyone in the world. "Tell me one thing. Did any of it matter? The battles we fought together, the strategies we built, the empire we created, was any of it real, or was it all just strategy aimed at this exact moment?" Cade's jaw tightened. "It mattered. You were a great king, but great kings know when to stop. And you didn't. Because I finally realized that ruling without purpose was just organized cruelty. No. Because you let one servant girl convince you that sentiment was stronger than discipline." Vaelor stared at him, and despite everything, despite the betrayal and the pain and the comprehensive destruction of his entire life, he felt clarity settle over him like armor made from acceptance instead of hope. "You're right. She did convince me. She convinced me that truth matters more than maintaining systems designed to protect incompetence. And you know what the worst part is?" Cade said nothing. "Even after all this, even after losing everything, I still believe she was right, which means either I'm delusional or you're terrified that she was right too." The silence between them stretched long enough to feel permanent. Then Cade turned and left without another word, and Vaelor stood alone in the cell, wondering if believing in something that got you destroyed was courage, or just another form of stupidity that civilization hadn't evolved past yet. Either way, at dawn, he'd be exiled to territories where power stopped mattering, and survival became the only metric worth measuring, and maybe that was exactly what he'd been trying to escape his entire life. The burden of being powerful without ever being free. The cage built from conquest and maintained through fear that looked like a throne but functioned like a prison. The slow death of everything human in exchange for the authority to rule over systems that crushed humanity by design. He'd spent 12 years fighting to maintain that prison, and now someone else could have it. Because Vaelor was done. Done fighting, done ruling. Done pretending that power mattered when the only person who'd ever made him feel like something other than a weapon wearing a crown was dead on rocks below cliffs. She'd jumped from because staying meant dying slower. At dawn, exile would begin. And for the first time in 12 years, Vaelor realized he was looking forward to it. Because exile meant freedom, and freedom was the one thing power could never buy. Dawn arrived cold and merciless across the obsidian cliffs of Stormfire Palace, and Vaelor stood in the transport wagon, wearing the kind of exhaustion that came from accepting you'd already lost everything worth fighting for. They'd dressed him in plain clothes, no armor, no ceremonial anything, just rough wool and leather, like any other prisoner being moved from one form of confinement to another, which was exactly what he was now. A fallen king reduced to political inconvenience that needed managing before it became a symbol somebody could rally around. 6 guards surrounded the wagon, wearing Volcar house colors and expressions that suggested they'd been told to prevent escape but hadn't been given orders about what to do if escape actually happened. Probably because everyone assumed a wounded, defeated, betrayed ex-king wouldn't have the will to try. They were probably right. Vaelor sat on the wooden bench and watched the palace he'd ruled from for 12 years grow smaller in the distance, and he tried to feel something other than hollow acceptance. Couldn't. All he felt was the absence of everything that used to define him, the weight of authority, the burden of decisions, the constant calculation of threats and opportunities and political maneuvering that kept empires functioning when functioning was all that separated civilization from collapse. Gone. All of it gone. And in its place was just emptiness, pretending to be peace. The wagon rolled through the eastern gates where guards who'd served under him for years looked away rather than make eye contact, which was probably the closest thing to mercy exile offered. Being seen as you fell was worse than falling invisible. They'd traveled maybe 3 miles down the coastal road when the first arrow hit. Not the wagon. One of the guards. Punched through his throat so fast he didn't even scream, just made a wet choking sound and fell off his horse onto packed dirt that turned red within seconds. The remaining guards drew weapons and scanned the tree line, shouting orders that got lost in the chaos of not knowing where the attack was coming from or how many attackers there were. A second arrow dropped another guard, then a third. Precision shots from someone who understood that killing efficiently meant targeting the highest threats first and working downward until resistance stopped being organized. The wagon driver panicked and whipped the horses into a run, which was exactly the wrong move because running meant losing formation, and losing formation meant isolated targets instead of defensive positioning. 2 more arrows, 2 more guards dead. The last guard jumped off his horse and sprinted toward the tree line, probably hoping escape was possible if he moved fast enough. He made it maybe 20 feet before someone stepped out of the shadows wearing travel-stained clothes and holding a bow that looked older than most kingdoms. Serena. Alive. Soaked and battered and moving like someone who'd survived a 70-foot fall into freezing water through luck and physics that should have killed her but somehow hadn't. She drew the bow and aimed directly at the fleeing guard's back, and her voice carried across the road with the kind of cold authority that suggested she was done asking permission for survival. Run faster, and I put this through your spine. Your choice. The guard froze. Smart man. Serena moved toward the wagon, bow still drawn, and her eyes found Vaelor sitting there in chains looking like he'd already died, but his body hadn't figured it out yet. You look terrible, she said. You're supposed to be dead. I got better. She climbed into the wagon and used a dagger to cut through the chains binding his wrists. And the moment the metal fell away, Vaelor felt something crack inside him that had been holding together through pure momentum. Not relief. Rage. Sudden, violent, clarifying rage at everyone who'd spent 3 weeks telling him that caring about her survival made him weak. When the truth was that caring about anything in a system designed to crush caring was the only form of strength that actually mattered. How did you survive? His voice came out rough. Jumped. Hit water at a bad angle. Dislocated shoulder, swam to shore, stole clothes and weapons from a supply wagon, followed your transport because I figured you'd need help, and everyone else you trusted turned out to be a liar. She met his eyes. Was I wrong? Vaelor stared at her, searching for answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. Questions about why she'd risk everything to rescue someone who'd already cost her everything. Questions about whether survival was enough, or whether survival only mattered if you were surviving alongside people who made survival worth the effort. He couldn't find words that worked, so he just shook his head. Good, Serena said, because we need to move. Volcar's consolidating power faster than expected. He executed 17 nobles yesterday for questioning his authority. He's declaring martial law across the southern territories, and he's spreading word that you died resisting arrest, which means officially you're a ghost. Vaelor climbed out of the wagon, legs shaking from 3 days of captivity and a stab wound that was definitely infected, and looked back toward Stormfire Palace, rising in the distance like a monument to everything he'd built, and everything he'd lost. Part of him wanted to burn it. Part of him wanted to walk away and never look back. But the part that had spent 12 years learning that empires didn't fix themselves through hope alone knew there was only one option left. Fight. Not for the throne, not for power, for the possibility that Serena had been right all along, that truth could survive even in systems designed to crush it, that change was possible if someone was willing to pay the price change demanded. And he'd already lost everything except the woman standing beside him holding a stolen bow and looking at him like he was still worth saving despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, which meant the price was already paid. The only question was whether payment bought evolution or just different forms of collapse. "Where do we go?" Serena asked. "The frontier fortresses. Find whoever stayed loyal, build resistance, force Volkar to prove his authority through warfare instead of political theater." He turned toward her. "You could still run, disappear into territories where Volkar's reach doesn't extend yet. Live whatever life you want without the weight of all this." Serena slung the bow across her back and started walking down the road away from the palace, and her voice carried the kind of exhausted certainty that came from making irrevocable decisions. "I could, but I won't. Because I spent my entire life watching people with power fail to use it for anything except maintaining their own comfort. And you were the first person with power who actually tried to change that. So if you're fighting, I'm fighting." She glanced back. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't die doing something stupid." Vaelor followed her down the road, and despite the pain, despite the betrayal, despite the comprehensive destruction of everything he'd spent 12 years building, he felt something dangerous stirring inside him. Not hope, purpose. The brutal, clarifying purpose that comes from having nothing left to lose except the principles you weren't willing to compromise even when compromise would have saved you. And principles without power were just philosophy. But principles backed by someone willing to burn empires to prove them? That was revolution. And revolutions were the only force in history stronger than fear. Mokal. The frontier fortress of Hollowspire sat at the edge of the Dominion like a middle finger aimed at anyone who thought borders were permanent, and Vaelor approached it 3 days later looking less like a king and more like a refugee who'd survived violence through luck instead of strategy. The journey had been brutal. 3 days of moving through territories where Volkar's authority was still contested, avoiding patrols, stealing food from supply wagons, and trying not to die from an infected stab wound that was definitely getting worse despite Serena's attempts at field medicine. But they'd made it. And waiting at the fortress gates was a sight that made Vaelor realize that loyalty wasn't completely dead even when it should have been. General Theron stood there, wearing battle-damaged armor, and leading maybe 400 soldiers who looked like they'd fought their way out of Stormfire Palace through sheer, bloody-minded refusal to accept that their king was dead. Behind them stood representatives from 6 frontier villages, carrying farming tools that doubled as weapons and expressions that suggested they'd finally gotten tired of being treated like expendable resources by people who'd never seen a battlefield. Vaelor stopped 10 feet from the gates, and Theron stepped forward with the kind of measured caution that came from not knowing whether the man in front of him was still the king he'd served or just a broken survivor wearing familiar faces. "Your Majesty," Theron said carefully, "we heard you were dead." "I heard that too. Turns out rumors are unreliable." Theron's jaw tightened, and his eyes moved from Vaelor to Serena and back, clearly calculating whether this was legitimate resistance or just desperation dressed as strategy. "Cade betrayed you," Theron said. "Worked with Volkar for years. Half the council supported the coup. Most of the military command went along because they thought you were already dead." "I know, and you're here because—" Vaelor straightened despite the pain radiating through his entire body, and his voice carried the kind of cold certainty that had ended arguments for 12 years. "Because Volkar represents everything I spent 12 years trying to evolve past. Fear-based leadership, authority without accountability, power maintained through terror instead of conviction. And if the Dominion falls back into that pattern, then 12 years of bloodshed led nowhere except more bloodshed." He paused. "So I'm here to offer a choice. You can join me and fight to prove that empires can evolve without collapsing, or you can return to Stormfire Palace and serve under a regent who believes domination is the only form of strength worth respecting." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel physical. Then one of the village representatives stepped forward, an older man with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too many harvests fail because noble houses prioritized tribute over survival. "You saved the frontier during the famine trials," the man said. "Sent grain when the capital wanted to let us starve. My village remembers. We'll fight," another voice from the crowd. "Mine too." And another. The wave built slowly, then faster, and within minutes Vaelor was looking at maybe 800 people who'd decided that fighting for change was worth the risk of dying for it. It wasn't an army, it was barely a resistance, but it was enough to make Volkar's consolidation of power complicated instead of inevitable. And complicated was all revolution needed to begin. Theron stepped closer, and his voice dropped low enough that only Vaelor could hear. "This is going to be a bloodbath. Volkar controls the capital, the council, and most of the professional military. We have frontier soldiers and farmers with pitchforks." "I know. So what's the strategy?" Vaelor looked past Theron toward the fortress walls that had defended the Dominion's borders for generations, and he felt the weight of 12 years' worth of tactical experience settle over him like armor made from scar tissue instead of steel. "We don't fight Volkar's war, we fight ours. He wants decisive battle, where superior numbers win. We give him guerrilla warfare where conviction matters more than force. Hit supply lines, disrupt communications, make every mile of territory he controls cost more than it's worth." He turned back toward Theron. "And we make it ideological. This isn't about who sits on the throne. This is about whether the Dominion evolves or collapses under the weight of maintaining systems that only benefit people who inherited power instead of earning it." Theron stared at him. "You're talking about civil war. I'm talking about evolution enforced through violence because evolution through policy failed. There's a difference. Which is? One rebuilds. The other just replaces who's crushing people." The fortress gates opened and Vaelor walked through them with Serena beside him and 800 people behind him who decided that truth was worth fighting for, even when fighting meant dying badly. And somewhere deep in his exhausted, wounded, betrayed soul, Vaelor felt something he hadn't felt in years. Certainty. Not the political certainty that came from calculating odds and managing risks. The moral certainty that came from knowing you were fighting for something that mattered more than survival. And certainty was the one thing fear could never defeat. Because fear worked by making people calculate whether resistance was worth the cost. But certainty didn't calculate. It just moved forward and forced everyone else to choose whether they were obstacles or allies. The first battle happened 6 days later at a supply convoy moving through the mountain passes, and it set the template for everything that followed. Vaelor didn't attack with formations or tactics designed for decisive victory. He attacked with precision strikes aimed at disruption instead of destruction. Burned the supply wagons, scattered the guards, left messages carved into trees that read simple truths people were too afraid to speak aloud. Fear is not strength. Obedience is not loyalty. Evolution is survival. The messages spread faster than Volkar could suppress them, and within 2 weeks the frontier territories were fracturing into open rebellion, not because Vaelor commanded it, but because people were finally seeing language that articulated what they'd felt for years, but didn't know how to express. That empires maintained through fear eventually collapse. That authority without accountability was just organized cruelty. That power only mattered if it protected people instead of crushing them. Simple truths. Dangerous truths. The kind of truths that toppled systems built on comfortable lies. Volkar responded exactly as Vaelor predicted, sent professional military units to crush rebellion through overwhelming force, declared martial law across contested territories, executed anyone caught spreading seditious messages. But every execution created martyrs. Every military crackdown pushed neutral villages toward resistance, and every day Volkar spent maintaining control through terror was a day he wasn't building legitimacy through conviction. The pattern held for 30 days. 30 days of guerrilla warfare where Vaelor fought less like a king and more like a ghost haunting an empire that wanted him dead but couldn't quite finish the job. 30 days of watching farmers become soldiers and soldiers become believers in something larger than survival. 30 days of Serena standing beside him, proving that competence mattered more than bloodline by organizing supply chains, negotiating alliances with frontier clans, and generally doing everything Aluna was supposed to do, except she was doing it without a crown or palace or any of the traditional markers of authority. She was doing it through competence. And competence was magnetic in ways fear never could be. On the 31st day, Volkar made his move. He gathered his full military force, maybe 10,000 professional soldiers, and marched toward Hollowspire Fortress with the clear intention of ending the rebellion through decisive battle that would prove superior numbers still won wars. Vaelor stood on the fortress walls, watching the army approach like a tide of steel and discipline, and he knew this was the moment that decided everything. Win in the rebellion became legitimate. Lose, and it became a footnote in history about why sentiment was weakness. Theron stood beside him, and his scarred face carried the kind of grim acceptance that came from calculating odds that didn't favor survival. "They outnumber us 12-1, Theron said quietly. "Maybe more." "I know. Our soldiers are mostly farmers and frontier guards. Theirs are professional killers." "I know. We can't win this in open battle." Vaelor turned toward him, and his amber eyes carried something that looked uncomfortably close to certainty, despite overwhelming evidence that certainty should be impossible. "We're not trying to win an open battle. We're trying to win the war that happens after this battle ends." Theron frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means Volkar thinks this is about military superiority. But it's not. It's about proving that people fight harder for truth than they fight for fear. And if we can make our soldiers believe that dying for evolution matters more than surviving under domination, then we've already won the only war that matters." He paused. "The question is whether I believe that. Do you?" Vaelor looked out at Volkar's approaching army, then back at the 800 soldiers standing behind him wearing mismatched armor and expressions that suggested they'd already accepted death but refused to accept defeat. "Ask me again when this is over." The battle for Hollowspire Fortress began at dawn, and within minutes it became clear that tactics only worked when both sides cared about minimizing casualties. Volkar didn't care. He sent wave after wave of professional soldiers against the fortress walls with the clear strategy of overwhelming defenders through sheer attrition, trading lives for ground because lives were renewable and ground was strategic. Vaelor watched from the eastern tower as his soldiers fought with the kind of desperate ferocity that came from knowing retreat wasn't possible and surrender meant execution. Farmers who'd never held weapons before fought like veterans. Frontier guards who'd spent years maintaining borders held positions like they were defending sacred ground. And Serena moved through the chaos organizing medical stations, redistributing ammunition, and generally proving that leadership wasn't about issuing orders from safety, but about being present in the violence you asked others to endure. The walls held for 3 hours, then breached. Volkar's forces poured through the opening like water finding cracks, and the battle transformed from defensive positioning to close-quarters chaos where training stopped mattering and only momentum kept you alive. Vaelor fought like something ancient and furious had been unleashed from chains, his sword moving with the kind of brutal efficiency that came from 2 decades of turning violence into art form. But even while fighting, he could feel the pattern emerging. They were losing. Not quickly, not decisively, but inevitably. Because numbers always won eventually, and Volkar had numbers backed by discipline and training, and the absolute certainty that fear-based authority was the only form of power worth respecting. Theron appeared beside him, bleeding from a dozen wounds, but still moving, still fighting, still refusing to accept that defeat was coming. "We need to retreat," Theron shouted over the chaos. "Fall back to secondary positions before they surround us completely." "There are no secondary positions," Vaelor shouted back. "This is it. We hold or we die. Then we die." The certainty in Theron's voice hit harder than any blade could have, because it meant loyalty had outlasted hope and was now just executing commands because executing commands was all that remained when strategy failed. Vaelor fought his way toward the central courtyard where Serena was directing wounded soldiers toward covered positions, and he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks. "You need to leave. Now." There's a tunnel beneath the eastern storage rooms that leads to the cliffs. You can escape before they find it. Serena stared at him like he'd started speaking a language that didn't exist yet. "I'm not leaving. This isn't negotiable. You survive or everything we fought for dies with us." "No," Serena said, and her voice carried absolute conviction despite the chaos surrounding them. "What we fought for only matters if people see that it's worth dying for. If I run, I prove Volcar right. That truth only matters when it's safe. That conviction is just sentiment that evaporates when tested. She pulled free from his grip. So I'm staying. And we're going to fight until there's nothing left to fight with. And when Volcar walks over our bodies, he's going to understand that he didn't just defeat an army, he defeated an idea. And ideas don't die when people do. Vaelor felt something crack inside him that had nothing to do with physical injury. Because she was right. Running preserved survival but destroyed meaning. Staying destroyed survival but preserved meaning. And meaning was the only thing that made any of this worth enduring. The battle raged for another hour, and every minute felt like watching an empire die in real time. Soldiers fell. Defenses crumbled. And slowly, inevitably, Volcar's forces pushed deeper into the fortress, like infection spreading through a wound that wouldn't heal. Vaelor found himself backed against the inner keep, with maybe 50 soldiers still standing, surrounded by hundreds of Volcar's forces, who were clearly waiting for someone to give the order that ended this. Then the crowd parted, and Volcar himself walked through wearing the crown of ash and armor that looked like it had never seen actual combat. He stopped 10 feet from Vaelor, and his face carried the kind of cold satisfaction that came from being proven right about everything you'd ever believed. "This is what conviction gets you," Volcar said. "Dead soldiers, failed revolution, proof that sentiment is weakness, and weakness is fatal." He gestured toward the devastation surrounding them. "You could have accepted exile, lived quietly, but you chose this. And now everyone who believed your lies about truth mattering more than strength is dead or dying." Vaelor stood there, bleeding and exhausted and surrounded by the ruins of everything he'd tried to build, and he felt something settle over him that looked like acceptance but functioned like fury. "You're right," Vaelor said quietly. "They're dead. They died believing that evolution was possible, that empires could survive without maintaining terror, that truth mattered even when truth got you killed." He straightened despite the pain. "And 50 years from now, when your fear-based authority collapses, because fear always collapses eventually, someone's going to remember that we tried, that we fought for something other than power, and that memory is going to inspire the next revolution, and the next, until eventually one of them succeeds." Volcar's smile faded. "There won't be any memory. I'm going to erase you so completely that history forgets you existed." He drew his sword. "Any last words?" Vaelor looked past Volcar toward the soldiers surrounding them, and his voice carried across the courtyard with the kind of exhausted honesty that cut through propaganda and political theater and every comfortable lie people told themselves to justify serving power instead of principles. "Fear is not strength. Obedience is not loyalty. And empires that rule through terror always collapse. Always. The only question is whether collapse leads to evolution or just different forms of domination." He met Volcar's eyes. "I chose evolution. You chose domination. Let history decide who was right." Volcar raised his sword, and the entire courtyard went silent. Then, from somewhere beyond the fortress walls came a sound that changed everything. War horns. Dozens of them. Not Volcar's forces. Someone else. The sound built like thunder approaching, and Vaelor saw Volcar's expression shift from satisfaction to confusion to something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. Then the eastern gates exploded inward, and through the smoke and debris poured an army that Vaelor didn't recognize, wearing colors he'd never seen, carrying banners that proclaimed a message he'd written weeks ago on burned supply wagons. Evolution is survival. And at the front of that army, wearing travel-stained armor and leading maybe 5,000 soldiers who looked like they'd marched through hell specifically to arrive at this exact moment, rode General Cade. But he wasn't leading Volcar's forces. He was leading rebellion, and his sword was aimed directly at the man wearing the crown of ash. The world stopped moving when General Cade rode through the shattered gates of Hollowspire Fortress, leading an army that shouldn't exist, and Vaelor felt his entire understanding of reality crack like ice under sudden weight. Because Cade had betrayed him, stabbed him, left him bleeding in the moon chamber while whispering apologies that meant nothing. And now he was here leading 5,000 soldiers, wearing colors that proclaimed evolution instead of domination, and his sword was aimed at Volcar like judgment itself had finally arrived to settle accounts that had been accumulating for years. Volcar turned slowly, and his face carried the kind of cold fury that came from realizing you'd been outmaneuvered by someone you thought you'd already defeated. "Cade," he said quietly. "What is this?" Cade dismounted and his boots hit stone with the finality of decisions that couldn't be unmade. He moved through the courtyard past soldiers who parted instinctively because they recognized predator movement when they saw it, and he stopped 10 feet from Volcar with his sword still raised. "This is the part where I tell you that betraying Vaelor was the worst mistake I ever made," Cade said. "And then I ask him to forgive me. And then we fight you together because you represent everything I spent 3 years pretending to believe in before I finally figured out I was lying to myself." His voice grew colder. "But that would be too simple. Too clean. So instead I'm going to tell you the truth." The courtyard went silent except for the wind moving through broken walls and the distant sound of wounded soldiers trying not to die. "I did betray Vaelor," Cade continued. "Worked with you for 3 years. Planned the coup. Executed it perfectly. Got exactly what I said I wanted, which was restoring the Empire to fear-based leadership maintained through disciplined violence." He paused. "And it took me exactly 12 hours after you took the throne to realize I'd destroyed the one thing worth protecting in this entire God's damned empire." Volcar's jaw tightened. Which was the possibility that strength didn't require cruelty, that authority could exist without terror, that maybe, just maybe, empires could evolve past the cycle of domination and collapse. That's defined civilization since the first king put a crown on and called it destiny. Cade turned toward Vaelor, and his eyes carried genuine regret so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. "You were right about everything, Your Majesty. Fear doesn't win loyalty. Domination doesn't create stability. And empires maintained only through terror always collapse eventually. I knew that. I've always known that. But I was too terrified to act on it because acting on it meant admitting that 12 years of serving you through violence was time spent building something that might actually matter, instead of just time spent preventing disaster." He lowered his sword slightly. "And the moment I stabbed you in that chamber, I realized I'd just killed the only version of Empire worth serving. So I left the palace, went to the frontier territories, started talking to soldiers who'd served under you, started asking whether they followed orders out of fear or conviction." Cade's voice grew quieter. "Turns out most of them followed you because they believed you were trying to build something better than what came before. And when I told them you were alive and fighting Volcar, 5,000 of them decided conviction mattered more than career survival." He looked back at Volcar. "So here we are. You wanted fear-based authority. You got it. But fear stops working the moment people realize dying for something meaningful is better than living for something hollow." Volcar stared at him, and his face carried the kind of calculating assessment that came from realizing the game had changed, but not yet understanding how to respond. "This is treason," Volcar said carefully. "No," Cade replied. "This is correction. I committed treason when I betrayed Vaelor. This is me fixing it." Then he turned back toward Vaelor, and his expression shifted into something that looked like a man standing trial before the only judge whose verdict actually mattered. "Your Majesty, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect trust. I stabbed you in the back after 20 years of standing beside you, and there's no strategy that makes that acceptable. But I'm asking for the chance to prove that people can change when they finally understand what they were protecting." The silence that followed was so absolute that Vaelor could hear his own heartbeat echoing against shattered stone walls. And in that silence, he felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy or political calculation. Because Cade was right, people could change, empires could evolve, and the only difference between evolution and collapse was whether you believed change was possible, even when change required forgiving people who'd destroyed you. Vaelor stepped forward, legs shaking from wounds and exhaustion and 3 weeks of fighting battles nobody should survive, and he stopped directly in front of Cade with his sword still in hand. For 5 full seconds, nobody moved. Then Vaelor spoke, and his voice carried the kind of exhausted honesty that came from spending 12 years learning that strength without purpose was just cruelty wearing a crown. "You betrayed me, stabbed me, left me to die. And it broke something inside me that I'm not sure will ever fully heal." Cade's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "But you came back," Vaelor continued. "Not because it was strategic, not because it served your interests, Because you finally understood that empires built only on fear die slowly and painfully, and you decided dying for evolution was better than living under domination. He paused. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to fight beside me one more time. And if we survive, we're going to build something better than what came before. And if we don't survive, at least we'll die honest instead of comfortable. Vaelor extended his hand. Welcome back, General. Cade stared at the offered hand like it was a miracle he didn't deserve. And when he finally gripped it, his eyes carried the kind of relief that comes from being forgiven for sins you thought were permanent. Thank you, Your Majesty. Don't thank me yet, Vaelor said. Thank me when this is over and the Empire is still standing. He turned toward Volcar, and his amber eyes carried the weight of 12 years' worth of decisions that had led to this exact moment. You wanted to prove that fear was stronger than conviction, so prove it. Your army against ours, superior numbers against desperate belief. Let's see which one survives. Volcar's face went cold, and his voice carried absolute certainty despite the fact that his strategic advantage had just evaporated. You think adding 5,000 soldiers changes anything? I still have numerical superiority, better training, superior positioning. All you've done is guarantee more people die, proving I was right. Maybe, Vaelor said quietly, or maybe you're about to learn that people fight harder for something they believe in than they fight for something they're afraid of. He raised his sword. Only one way to find out. The second battle for Hollowspire Fortress was nothing like the first. The first had been about attrition, numbers overwhelming positions, fear enforced through systematic violence. The second was about ideology. Every soldier wearing Vaelor's colors understood they were fighting for the possibility that empires could evolve without collapsing. That strength didn't require cruelty, that authority could exist without terror, and that understanding made them terrifying. Because soldiers fighting for survival stopped when survival looked impossible. But soldiers fighting for meaning kept fighting until meaning was proven or extinguished. Volcar's forces outnumbered them still, maybe 8,000 against 6,000 after the reinforcements arrived. But numbers only mattered when both sides cared about minimizing casualties. Vaelor's forces didn't care. They fought like people who'd already accepted death, and were now just determining whether death meant something or was wasted on comfortable lies. The battle raged across broken courtyards and shattered walls, while the sun climbed higher and turned stone into furnaces that cooked everyone fighting on them. Blood mixed with sweat, mixed with ash from fires that had been burning since dawn, and the whole fortress smelled like violence wearing civilization's skin. Vaelor fought beside Cade the way they'd fought together for 20 years, and muscle memory took over where trust had been destroyed. Block, counter, strike, and the rhythm built until they were moving like one organism with two sets of hands and zero tolerance for anything that threatened survival. Serena fought nearby, and watching her move through chaos with a sword she'd barely known how to hold 3 weeks ago was proof that competence mattered more than bloodline. She wasn't graceful, wasn't trained, but she was effective in the brutal way that came from understanding that survival was about eliminating threats before they eliminated you. The tide turned slowly, not because Vaelor's forces were stronger, because they refused to break even when breaking was the logical response to overwhelming odds. And refusal created momentum that spread like fire through dry timber, and suddenly Volcar's professional soldiers were the ones retreating because retreat was possible when you were fighting for a paycheck instead of a principle. By midday, Volcar's army had fractured into isolated pockets of resistance that were being systematically eliminated by soldiers who decided that dying for evolution was better than surviving under domination. And at the center of it all, Vaelor finally found himself face to face with the man who'd tried to erase him from history. Lord Volcar stood in the central courtyard surrounded by maybe 24 loyal guards, still wearing the crown of ash like it belonged to him. And his face carried the kind of cold fury that came from realizing you'd lost but refusing to accept defeat. You should have stayed exiled, Volcar said, should have accepted that sentiment was weakness and moved on. But you came back, risked everything. And for what? To prove that conviction matters? He gestured at the devastation surrounding them. Look at what conviction got you. Thousands dead, fortress destroyed, empire fractured, all because you couldn't accept that some truths are too expensive to prove. Vaelor stepped closer, sword still raised, and his voice carried the kind of exhausted certainty that came from spending 12 years learning what actually mattered. You're right. Conviction cost everything. Thousands died. The empire fractured, and it was worth it. Volkar's eyes widened slightly. Worth it? Because the alternative was accepting that fear was the only form of authority worth respecting. That domination was the only path to stability. That empires had to choose between terror and collapse with nothing in between. Vaelor's amber eyes caught the sunlight filtering through smoke and ash. And I spent 12 years believing that. 12 years ruling through fear, crushing rebellions, expanding borders, making kingdoms kneel. And it worked. The empire prospered. Stability held. Power accumulated. He paused. But I was dying the entire time. One betrayal at a time. One political compromise at a time. One decision that prioritized survival over meaning at a time. And if I'd stayed on that path, I would have eventually become exactly what you represent. A ruler who maintains power through terror, because terror is all that's left when you've sacrificed everything else. Volkar's jaw tightened. So you chose this instead. Civil war, bloodshed, the destruction of everything you built. No, Vaelor said quietly. I chose the possibility that empires can evolve, that strength doesn't require cruelty, that authority can exist without terror. And even if I'm wrong, even if this fails completely, at least people will remember that someone tried. He raised his sword. And memory is stronger than fear. Always. The fight that followed was brutal and personal, driven less by tactics than by ideology. Two visions of power colliding violently. Domination versus evolution. Fear versus conviction. Volkar fought like someone who'd spent 60 years perfecting violence as a form of communication, and his blade moved with the kind of disciplined precision that came from believing power was measured by body count. But Vaelor fought like someone who'd finally figured out what he was protecting, and purpose made him faster, stronger, more willing to accept wounds that would have made him hesitate before. The fight lasted maybe 3 minutes, felt like hours, and ended when Vaelor's blade caught Volkar across the ribs, hard enough to shatter bone, but not hard enough to kill immediately. Volkar collapsed, and blood spread across stone floors that had witnessed more violence in one day than most battlefields saw in months. Vaelor stood over him, sword raised, and the entire courtyard went silent, watching the moment that would define whether this revolution was about replacing who ruled or changing how ruling worked. Finish it, Volkar said through gritted teeth. Prove that evolution is just domination wearing prettier words. Vaelor stared down at him, and every instinct screamed to end this permanently, to eliminate the threat, to prove that strength meant decisive action without mercy. But then he remembered Serena standing in the war chamber dismantling his invasion plan. Remembered her saying that real strength wasn't about dominating everyone around you, but about being strong enough to admit when domination served ego instead of empire. And he lowered his sword. No, Vaelor said quietly. I'm not proving anything except that mercy is possible even when mercy is expensive. He turned toward the remaining soldiers, and his voice carried across the courtyard with absolute finality. The war is over. Volkar lives. He'll stand trial before a council that includes representatives from every territory across the Dominion, not just noble houses. And that trial will determine whether his actions constituted legitimate challenge or treasonous coup. He paused. But either way, the empire changes today. No more rule through fear alone. No more authority without accountability. No more systems that only benefit people who inherited power instead of earning it. The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief because mercy was the one thing nobody expected from a king who'd spent 12 years ruling through calculated violence. But mercy was also the one thing that proved evolution was possible. That strength didn't require cruelty. That empires could survive without maintaining terror. Cade stepped forward, and his voice carried careful uncertainty. Your Majesty, if we let him live, he becomes a symbol for everyone who believes the old ways were better. Good, Vaelor said. Let him be a symbol. Let people see that the new empire is strong enough to tolerate dissent without crushing it. That confidence is stronger than fear. He looked down at Volkar. You wanted to prove that sentiment was weakness. Instead, you proved that cruelty was exhaustion pretending to be strength. And exhaustion always loses to purpose eventually. Volkar stared up at him with eyes that carried fury and pain, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding that he'd lost more than a battle. He'd lost the ideological war that mattered. But, 3 months later, Stormfire Palace stood transformed in ways that were both subtle and absolute. The throne room looked the same. Black marble columns, vaulted ceilings, wolf sigils carved into stone walls. But the energy was different, less suffocating, less oppressive, like someone had opened windows in a tomb and reminded everyone that light existed outside the darkness. The Iron Throne remained, but Vaelor had ordered a second seat placed beside it. Equal height, equal prominence, built from the same materials but designed to communicate partnership instead of subordination. And sitting in that second seat, wearing a crown forged from silver and ash and looking like she'd been born to rule despite spending most of her life invisible, was Empress Vaelor Draven, no longer a servant, no longer an archivist, a leader who'd earned authority through competence instead of inheriting it through bloodline. The Sovereign Assembly had replaced the old council system, and representatives now came from territories across the Dominion based on population and contribution instead of just noble lineage. Farmers sat beside dukes, merchants debated with generals, and decisions got made through argumentation instead of intimidation. It was messy, inefficient, and infinitely better than what came before. Vaelor stood in the moon chamber overlooking the frozen sea, and he tried to remember what exhaustion felt like when exhaustion was all that defined him. Couldn't quite recall. The wound in his back had healed into scar tissue that still ached when storms approached, which was often enough to serve as permanent reminder that betrayal left marks even when betrayal got forgiven. But the ache was manageable. Everything was manageable now. The door opened behind him, and Serena entered wearing the kind of comfortable silence that came from spending 3 months learning how to rule beside someone instead of beneath them. She moved to the window and stood beside him, and they watched the waves crash against obsidian cliffs while the sun set over territories that had chosen evolution over collapse. "How was the assembly session?" Vaelor asked. "Brutal. 3 hours of arguing over grain distribution policy. Duke Marin thinks the capital deserves preferential allocation. The frontier representatives think equal distribution regardless of strategic importance." "Who won?" "Nobody yet. We reconvene tomorrow." Vaelor smiled slightly. "Democracy is exhausting." "Better than the alternative," Serena said, "where you just declared policy and executed anyone who disagreed." He turned toward her, and his amber eyes carried something that looked like contentment mixed with permanent wariness, because power attracted threats even when power was maintained through conviction instead of fear. "Do you ever regret it? Walking into that throne room and accepting the trial?" Serena considered the question carefully before answering. "Every day," she said honestly. "I regret the people who died, the soldiers who fought believing evolution was possible, the villages that burned because they supported change instead of stability. The cost was enormous." She paused. "But I don't regret fighting, because fighting proved that empires can evolve without collapsing. That strength doesn't require cruelty. That authority can exist without terror. And even if we'd lost, even if Volcar had won and executed everyone involved, at least people would have seen that someone tried." Vaelor studied her face, searching for the exhaustion he felt reflected there, and finding instead something that looked like purpose wearing comfortable clothes. "You're better at this than I ever was," he said quietly. "At what?" "Ruling without forgetting why ruling matters." Serena turned toward him, and her eyes carried the kind of understanding that came from shared trauma forged into shared purpose. "That's because you spent 12 years believing survival was enough. But survival is just buying time. Purpose is what makes time worth buying." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the small scars on her hands from 3 months of learning that leadership meant getting wounded in ways that didn't always heal cleanly. "You taught me that," she said, "by finally admitting that power without meaning was just organized cruelty, by choosing evolution even when evolution cost everything, by being strong enough to forgive Cade even though forgiving him meant admitting betrayal wasn't permanent." Vaelor felt something settle inside him that had been restless for 12 years. Not peace exactly, but the absence of constant warfare between who he was and who he needed to be to survive. For the first time since taking the throne, he felt like the man wearing the crown and the man beneath it were the same person. And that unity was more valuable than any military victory or political triumph could ever be. Cade entered the chamber without knocking, which meant either emergency or routine depending on whether his face carried urgency or exhaustion. Currently it carried exhaustion, which meant routine. Your Majesties, the frontier reports are compiled. Rebellion activity down 70%. Trade routes reopening. Villages requesting infrastructure investment instead of military protection. He paused. The Empire is stabilizing. Vaelor nodded slowly. What about Volcar? Still imprisoned. Still refusing to acknowledge that fear-based authority failed. But he's become irrelevant. Nobody's rallying behind him anymore. Because conviction defeated fear, Serena said quietly. Cade's expression shifted into something that carried permanent regret alongside functional acceptance. Yes. And I'm still processing how long it took me to understand that. He turned toward Vaelor. I'll never stop apologizing for the betrayal. I know that. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. But I want you to know that every decision I make now is aimed at proving people can change when they finally understand what they were protecting. Vaelor met his eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. An acknowledgement that trust was rebuilt through actions instead of words, and actions took time that couldn't be accelerated through apologies. Keep proving it, Vaelor said simply. Cade nodded and left, and the silence that followed was comfortable in ways silence had never been, when ruling meant constant calculation of threats and opportunities. You know what the hardest part is? Vaelor said after a long moment. What? Living with the knowledge that this almost didn't happen. That if Serena hadn't walked into that throne room, if Cade hadn't changed, if the frontier soldiers hadn't believed evolution was worth fighting for, the Dominion would have collapsed back into fear-based authority maintained through systematic violence. He paused, and millions of people would have suffered under systems designed to crush anyone who didn't fit the mold. Not because those systems were necessary, because nobody was willing to pay the cost of changing them. Serena moved closer and took his hand, and her grip carried the kind of strength that came from surviving things that should have destroyed her but somehow didn't. But it did happen, she said. And now people across the Empire know that change is possible, that strength doesn't require cruelty, that authority can exist without terror, and that knowledge is spreading faster than we can control it. She smiled, which means other empires are watching. Other rulers are calculating whether evolution is possible for them too. And eventually, one of them is going to try. And another. Until the entire world understands that fear-based authority is just exhaustion pretending to be strength. Vaelor pulled her closer, and they stood there in the fading light watching an empire that had chosen evolution over collapse, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope that came from needing outcomes you couldn't control, but the quiet hope that came from knowing you'd done everything possible to create conditions where better outcomes were at least possible. And possibility was all revolution ever needed. The rest was just time and conviction and the willingness to keep fighting even when fighting looked impossible. Depoik. 1 year later, Vaelor stood in the Hall of Ancestors watching Serena address the first fully representative sovereign assembly, and he tried to remember what ruling alone felt like. Couldn't quite recall. The hall was packed with delegates from every territory across the Dominion, farmers and merchants and soldiers and scholars, and representatives from populations that had been invisible for generations. And Serena stood before them wearing the crown and authority and absolute conviction that leadership meant serving people instead of being served by them. The Dominion has survived its first year under the new system, she said, her voice carrying across marble floors that had witnessed more political evolution in 12 months than most empires saw in centuries. We faced challenges. Resistance from traditionalists who believed the old ways were better, economic disruption from redistributing resources more equitably, growing pains from building institutions designed to prioritize people over power. She paused. But we've survived. And survival proves that evolution is possible even when evolution is expensive. The hall erupted into applause that sounded less like political theater and more like genuine belief that change had actually happened. Vaelor watched from the gallery, and beside him stood Cade wearing the insignia of Royal Protector, a position he'd earned through 2 years of proving that betrayal wasn't permanent and people could change when they finally understood what they were protecting. She's good at this, Cade said quietly. Better than I ever was, Vaelor agreed. Because she never forgot that power was a tool instead of a destination. You spent 12 years treating the throne like something you had to defend at all costs. She treats it like something that only matters if it serves people who can't defend themselves. Vaelor turned toward him. You don't think I serve people? Cade met his eyes without hesitation. You serve survival, which meant people benefited when their survival aligned with yours. But she serves people even when serving them costs her personally. There's a difference. The word should have stung. Instead, they settled like truth that was uncomfortable but necessary. Because Cade was right, Vaelor had spent 12 years prioritizing stability over everything else. And stability required maintaining systems that worked even when those systems crushed people who didn't fit. But Serena had spent 2 years proving that stability could exist alongside equity if you were willing to rebuild foundations instead of just maintaining structures. And rebuilding was slower, messier, and infinitely more meaningful than maintenance. The assembly session ended, and delegates filed out carrying the kind of exhausted satisfaction that came from arguing policy until better solutions emerged, instead of just accepting whatever authority declared. Serena descended from the speaking platform, and when she reached Vaelor, her face carried the kind of tired contentment that came from doing work that actually mattered. "How'd I do?" "You made ruling look like service instead of domination," Vaelor said, "which means half the empire is inspired and the other half is terrified." "Good," Serena said. "Terrified means they're paying attention." They walked together through corridors that Vaelor had spent 12 years navigating alone. And the difference between solitary authority and shared leadership was the difference between surviving and actually living. He'd been surviving for so long that he'd forgotten living was possible. But Serena reminded him every day, not through grand gestures or political maneuvering, through small moments of genuine connection that proved power didn't have to isolate you if you were willing to share it with people who understood that authority was responsibility, wearing a different name. They reached the Eastern Tower, overlooking territories that stretched toward horizons Vaelor had conquered through violence, and Serena was rebuilding through conviction, and he felt something settle inside him that had been restless since the day he took the throne. Acceptance. Not of circumstances, of himself. The man who'd ruled through fear because fear was all he trusted. The man who'd finally learned that strength without purpose was just cruelty wearing a crown. The man who'd paid every possible price to prove that empires could evolve without collapsing. And the man who'd survived long enough to see evolution begin. It wasn't perfect, wasn't complete, but it was real. And reality was all hope ever needed to become something more than wishful thinking. "I'm glad you walked into that throne room," Vaelor said quietly. Serena leaned against him, and her presence carried the kind of comfortable weight that came from shared exhaustion forged into shared purpose. "I'm glad you let me stay," she replied. They stood there watching the sun set over an empire that had chosen truth over comfortable lies. And Vaelor realized something that 12 years of ruling alone had never taught him. Power mattered less than purpose. Authority mattered less than connection. And survival only meant something if you were surviving alongside people who made survival worth the cost. He'd spent 12 years learning that lesson the hard way. But he'd learned it. And learning meant evolution was possible even for people who'd spent lifetimes believing domination was the only form of strength worth respecting. The Dominion would face more challenges. More resistance from traditionalists who wanted fear-based authority restored. More growing pains from building systems that prioritized equity over expedience. But those challenges were manageable now, because authority built on conviction was stronger than authority built on fear, because shared leadership was more sustainable than solitary rule, and because two people standing together could carry weight that would crush one person standing alone. Vaelor had spent 12 years standing alone. Never again. As the stars emerged above Stormfire Palace, the king and empress of the Dominion stood together watching an empire transform. And they knew that transformation would continue long after they were gone. Because evolution wasn't about individual leaders. It was about building systems strong enough to survive leadership transitions without collapsing back into patterns that served power instead of people. And they'd built those systems. Not perfectly, not completely, but well enough that possibility had become probability. And probability was all the future ever needed. Somewhere in the palace below, the Sovereign Assembly was debating infrastructure policy. Frontier villages were planning harvests without calculating tribute costs. Soldiers were training for defense instead of conquest. And children were growing up in an empire that taught them competence mattered more than bloodline. The revolution had succeeded. Not through violence alone, But through the grinding, exhausting, glorious work of proving that change was possible, even when change required sacrificing everything comfortable. And as Vaelor stood beside Serena watching their empire breathe without the weight of terror crushing it, he finally understood what ruling actually meant. Not domination, service, not fear, trust, not survival alone. Purpose worth surviving for. The Alpha King had spent 12 years building an empire through conquest. But the man beneath the crown had spent 2 years rebuilding it through conviction. And conviction had won. Not because it was easier, because it was true. And truth, once proven, could never be fully erased, even when comfortable lies tried their best.